There is a name so unsettling, so deeply wrong in the way that truly dangerous things are wrong, that even the most broken and depraved servants of darkness will not say it at full volume. Not the berserker warriors of Khorne, who drench entire worlds in arterial red and pile skulls into mountains large enough to cast shadows across battlefields the size of continents. Not the diseased missionaries of Nurgle, who spread their warm and pestilent love across the stars with the cheerful inevitability of something that has long since stopped caring whether it is welcome. Not the endlessly scheming sorcerers of Tzeentch, who write their plots in the fabric of time itself and read futures the way scholars read texts, always 17 moves ahead of everyone else, and satisfied by that fact in the specific way that only very intelligent people who are also profoundly evil can be satisfied. Not the ecstatic devotees of Slaanesh, who have taken every moral limit they were ever handed and thrown it into a fire, and who danced in the warmth of the burning without regret. No, those people, those utterly shattered, thoroughly condemned, irreversibly committed servants of the most malevolent forces in the observable universe, they will not say this name out loud. They whisper it when they have to. When something forces the acknowledgement, when the context demands it, and there is no other way to refer to the thing being discussed, they lean close and drop their voices below the ambient noise of whatever nightmare they are currently living through. And they say it quietly. And even then, they look over their shoulders first. They glance upward toward the churning sky of the warp, that infinite and howling dimension where gods are born from feeling and die from forgetting. And before they speak, they become very quiet, very still. As though stillness is a form of protection. As though if they do not make waves, the thing they are about to name will not notice the ripple of its name being spoken. The name is Malice. And before it was Malice, it was Malal. Welcome, wherever you are settling in to spend this time. Get comfortable. Pull something warm around you if the night is cold where you are, because we are going to go deep tonight, deeper than most explorations of Warhammer 40,000 ever quite reach, into a corner of this universe that is kept deliberately dark, that the people who build this setting have spent 40 years managing with extraordinary care, acknowledging just enough that it cannot be completely ignored, and obscuring just enough that it cannot be completely understood. We are going to talk about the chaos god that Games Workshop spent 40 years quietly trying to pretend does not exist. The fifth god, the outcast, the renegade. The one who turned his burning attention not outward toward the Imperium of Man, not toward the alien empires scattered across the stars, not toward the mortal races whose fear and love and rage and grief sustain all of the ruinous powers, but inward toward his own kin, toward the other, chaos gods themselves. We are going to talk about Malice, and along the way we are going to unravel one of the most genuinely strange and fascinating stories in the entire history of this hobby. It is a story that begins with a copyright dispute between legendary British comic writers and a company that would eventually become one of the most valuable hobby businesses on the planet. It involves a champion armed with a soul-drinking axe made of bone who rode a demonic horse through the burning ruins of fantasy cities, shouting something about thirst. It involves the systematic and deliberate erasure of a divine being from an entire fictional universe, not through any dramatic narrative event, but through the dry and grinding machinery of intellectual property law. It involves a renegade space marine chapter that practices ritualistic cannibalism, communicates exclusively in whispers, fights in total silence, and regards both the Imperium of Man and every other Chaos faction with exactly the same cold and structural hatred, the hatred of something that has been wronged so completely and so fundamentally that it no longer makes distinctions between different categories of enemy. And it involves one single published moment when a god with eyes of fire was called into the physical universe and stood in a great dark hall and looked at everything his faithful had built for him. Above all of it, underneath all of it, threaded through every element of this story, like a dark current that never stops running, is a theological concept so perfectly constructed that it almost feels inevitable in retrospect. Malice is the part of chaos that eats itself. He is the embodiment of the universe's own tendency to turn inward and devour. He is what happens when a force defined by destruction turns that destruction on its own foundations. He grows stronger every single time the other Chaos gods grow stronger, feeding parasitically on their victories, using their power as his sustenance, and existing for the singular purpose of ensuring that their power ultimately means nothing, because nothing ultimately means anything. He is the answer to a question the other gods prefer not to hear asked. If everything eventually falls to chaos, what does chaos fall to? The answer, of course, is malice. He is chaos eating itself. He is the logical and inevitable conclusion of a system built entirely on conflict and consumption. And the other gods fear him not because he is stronger than them, not because his armies outnumber theirs, not because his champions are more skilled or more numerous, but because he represents something they cannot argue against, cannot scheme around, cannot seduce or corrupt or simply overwhelm. He represents the truth that chaos, taken to its absolute and purest extreme, in any direction, across any scale of time, ends only in one thing: absolute nothing. Before we can understand malice, before we can appreciate why his existence generates such genuine unease, even among beings of almost incomprehensible power, we need to understand the universe he inhabits at a fundamental level. We need to understand not just what the warp is, but what it means. Not just the surface-level understanding that the warp is dangerous and full of demons, and best avoided when possible, but the deep structural understanding of why it is dangerous, what it is made of, and why the things that live in it are the things that they are. Because once you understand that, once you truly internalize what the warp is, and how it produces the beings it produces, the existence of malice stops being surprising. It becomes inevitable. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching this from, and what time it is for you right now. I always love knowing who is out there in the dark with me. And if this kind of slow and careful exploration of the lore is what you come here for, please subscribe. It helps more than you know, and there is so much more waiting to be explored. To understand malice, you have to understand the warp, and you have to understand it properly. Not as a travel hazard or a convenient source of demonic antagonists, but as the fundamental psychic substrate of the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe, the parallel dimension that is to consciousness what space is to matter, the place where feeling goes when it has nowhere else to be. The warp exists alongside the material universe in a relationship that defies the kind of spatial metaphor we normally use to describe the relationship between places. It is not above the material universe or below it or beside it in any direction that ordinary geometry can describe. It exists in the same locations as the material universe, but in a different dimensional register, the same way that a building and the history of that building occupy the same place, without the history being physically present in the brickwork. The warp is the emotional history of everything that has ever thought or felt, given a dimension to exist in. Every conscious mind in the material universe generates psychic energy. This is not metaphorical. In the Warhammer setting, thought and feeling are physically real forces. They have weight and substance in the warp, the way matter has weight and substance in normal space. When a human being feels rage, that rage does not merely exist as a chemical state in the brain. It exists as a ripple in the warp, a small and momentary disturbance in the psychic ocean that underlies normal reality. When 10,000 people feel rage simultaneously, that ripple becomes a wave. When 1 billion people feel rage across the span of centuries, that wave becomes a current, and currents in the warp have consequences. Now multiply that by every species that has ever lived. The orcs, that ancient and profoundly martial species, generate enormous amounts of a very particular kind of psychic energy, the savage and joyful kind that comes from creatures who have been biologically optimized for violence, experiencing precisely the thing they were optimized for. The Aeldari, older than most civilizations currently existing in the galaxy, with emotional depths and artistic refinements that dwarf anything humanity has produced, generate psychic energy of an intensity and a complexity that makes human psychic output look crude by comparison. The Tyranids, vast and alien and collective, generate something that is not quite emotion in any recognizable sense, but that has its own psychic weight. The Tau, younger and less psychically active than most species, still contribute their small portion of the great total. All of it goes into the warp. All of it accumulates there, pools there, mixes and flows, and over geological timescales develops the kinds of patterns that complex systems always develop when they have enough input and enough time to process it. Those patterns are the first seeds of gods. When enough of the same kind of feeling concentrates in one region of the warp, when a particular emotional current runs strong and persistent enough for long enough and draws sustenance from enough different minds, experiencing similar things, something extraordinary happens. The current becomes self-aware. The accumulated psychic mass develops something like consciousness, or more precisely, it develops something that functions like consciousness in the way that a sufficiently complex weather system might be said to have something like intention. And once it has consciousness of a kind, it can begin to act. It can reach back toward the material universe and influence it. It can attract more of the feeling that constitutes its being. It can grow. What grows is a god. Not a god in the sense of a being who existed before the universe and created it. Not a god in the sense of a perfect and omnipotent entity whose will is law across all reality. A god in the much more specific and more terrifying sense of a being of supreme psychic power, whose nature is defined entirely by the emotion that generated it, who exists in the warp as a permanent and self-sustaining storm of that emotion, and who acts in the material universe by drawing on the mortal expressions of that emotion to fuel further manifestations of itself. The four great chaos gods emerged from the most universal and most powerful human emotions across the longest spans of time. Khorne is the blood god, born from violence. He is not simply the embodiment of the act of killing, but of the entire emotional complex that surrounds it, the rage that precedes it, the bloodlust that accompanies it, the specific and terrible satisfaction that follows it in beings who have been pushed to their limit and found violence to be the answer. He is the oldest of the four, born earliest in galactic history, from the first moments when sentient creatures began killing each other with intent, and he has been growing ever since. Every battle fought anywhere by anyone for any reason adds the tiniest increment to his power. He is, by most accounts, the mightiest of the four great gods in terms of raw strength, sustained as he is by the most universal and most inescapable of all mortal experiences. His domain in the warp is constructed entirely from what he is, a vast and eternal battlefield, a sky of brass. A mountain of skulls so enormous that its base extends beyond the visible horizon in every direction, and its peak is lost in the blood-red clouds above. At its summit, the blood god sits on his throne, and around him everything exists in one of two states, fighting or waiting to fight. There is no peace in Khorne's realm, no rest, no respite. There is only the war, and the war, and the war, world without end. Nurgle is the plague lord, born from despair, from the specific and terrible emotional experience of watching something you love decay, from the particular flavor of suffering that comes with illness, with the body's betrayal of itself, with the slow dissolution of everything physical into something different and lesser. Every plague that has ever swept a world, every person who has ever watched fever consume someone they valued, every moment of confrontation with the fact that living things rot has added something to what would eventually become the Lord of Pestilence. What makes Nurgle strange, and in many ways genuinely more disturbing than Khorne, is that he made peace with what he represents. He embraced it. His domain in the warp is not a landscape of pure horror, but a pastoral nightmare, gardens of rotting abundance, warm and fecund, and crawling with the secondary life that thrives in decay, presided over by a vast and jolly entity who finds genuine joy in the company of his followers, and who tends to them, in his horrific way, with something that functions like genuine affection. His followers feel loved, they feel chosen, they feel that their suffering has meaning because it is received and valued by something greater than themselves. They are wrong in the way that devotion always involves a kind of productive wrongness, but their feeling is real, and Nurgle feeds on it with the same warmth that he feeds on everything else. Tzeentch is the changer of ways, born from ambition and the desire for change. From the restlessness that is fundamental to nearly every conscious mind, the sense that things could be different, could be better, could be remade, he feeds on hope and scheming both, because both require imagining a world that is not the world that currently exists, and that act of creative negation, that mental construction of a possible alternative future, is his essential sustenance. He is the most intellectually complex of the four, the one whose operations are most difficult to understand because he operates at a remove of several causal steps from his immediate actions. He never does the thing he appears to be doing. He is always doing 17 other things that the thing he appears to be doing is merely a cover for. His domain is a castle of 1,000 rooms, none of which connect to the same place twice, a structure that is always rearranging itself, that cannot be mapped, because any map becomes obsolete before the ink is dry. And then there is Slaanesh, the youngest and in many ways the most philosophically interesting of the four, because of the specific and documented way in which Slaanesh came into being. The other three great gods emerged slowly, accumulating power over eons as the emotional currents they embody built in the warp. Slaanesh was born in a single cataclysmic moment, born from the Aldari. The Aldari were an ancient and magnificent species, older than human civilization by spans of time that make human history seem brief, who built a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and refinement. They pursued art and sensation and experience with a depth and an intensity that no other species had ever approached. Their culture was dedicated to the perfection of feeling, to the elevation of every experience to its highest possible expression. And the psychic weight of billions of minds pursuing that elevation across thousands of years of culture created something in the warp that grew and grew and grew until it could not be contained. When Slaanesh was born, the birth scream tore the souls out of nearly every Eldari alive at the time. It carved out of the warp a vast and permanent wound called the Eye of Terror, a place where the barrier between the warp and real space collapsed and has never recovered. The Eldari went from being the dominant species of the galaxy to being a scattered remnant, their civilization shattered, their numbers reduced to a fraction of what they had been, their gods mostly dead and their future uncertain. All of this because the most refined and intense version of the emotion of experience had been pushed so far that it crystallized into a god that was defined by excess, by the pushing of every sensation and every experience beyond the limits of what a mortal mind can sustain. These four, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, the ruinous powers, the dark gods, the ones whose names are taught to every imperial citizen, the ones who define what chaos means in the cultural and theological vocabulary of the 41st millennium. But the warp is not a place with quotas. It does not produce exactly 4 gods and stop. The process that generated the 4 great gods continues operating, generating from the endless input of mortal emotion and mortal psychic energy the full range of things that those emotions can produce. Minor gods proliferate in the spaces between the great ones, small entities crystallizing from narrow emotional frequencies, brief convergences of feeling that achieve sufficient mass to become self-aware, but not sufficient mass to challenge the dominance of the Great Four. They flicker and pulse in the dark corners of the immaterium, sometimes attracting followers, sometimes granting gifts, always too small to matter in the cosmic war between the great gods and the mortal races, but always real, always present, always potentially dangerous in the specific and limited way that small and hungry things are always dangerous. And then there is one that defies easy categorization. One that is not minor in the conceptual sense, even if it may be minor in the immediately measurable sense of raw power. One that represents something as vast and as fundamental as anything the 4 great gods embody. One that did not emerge from an emotion as narrow as any of the 4 great gods' domains, but from something larger, something that encompasses all of them, something that is the logical conclusion of what all of them are, one that represents chaos turning on itself. That one has a name, and that name, and the strange and winding journey it has taken through 40 years of fictional history, is what we have come here tonight to explore. The year is 1985. Warhammer as a miniature game is still young, still in the energetic and slightly anarchic creative period that defines any artistic project before it becomes commercially dominant enough to require careful management. Games Workshop is producing publications with an immediacy and a willingness to experiment that larger and more established companies rarely permit themselves. The creative atmosphere in their Nottingham offices during this era is, by all accounts, genuinely electric. A mixture of artistic talent and literary ambition, and a kind of productive recklessness that produces things that would probably not get made if anyone stopped to fully consider the risk. Among their publications is the Citadel Compendium, a resource for hobbyists that combines product listings with substantial creative content. The third edition of this compendium arrives in 1985, and inside it, presented with the same matter-of-fact confidence as everything else, is a 10-page comic strip, not a simple illustrated story. A properly scripted, properly drawn, genuinely ambitious narrative comic set in the Warhammer fantasy world. This comic was scripted by John Wagner and Alan Grant. If those names mean anything to you outside the context of Warhammer, it is probably because of Judge Dredd. Wagner and Grant are two of the defining writers of British comics during this era, architects of 2000 AD, contributors to a tradition of science fiction and fantasy comic writing that shaped British popular culture in ways that are still being felt. They work in a tradition that values ideas, that takes moral complexity seriously, that builds characters who occupy genuinely complicated positions in their worlds, rather than simply serving as vessels for action sequences. When they were commissioned to produce content for Games Workshop's Warhammer universe, they did what any writer worth their name would do when entering an established creative world. They did not simply adopt what was already there. They added something. The character they created was Caleb Dark, and the god they invented for Caleb to serve was Malal. The origin story begins in destruction, and it begins specifically with the kind of destruction that creates the most particular and the most permanent kind of emotional damage. Caleb Dark's city is attacked by the forces of chaos. Not in a way that is personal or targeted, not because anyone specifically wanted what was in that city or had a specific quarrel with its inhabitants, but in the way that chaos violence usually happens, because the followers of the Dark Gods were moving in that direction, and destroying things was what they did when they arrived places. His parents were killed, not heroically, not in a way that made their deaths mean something in any cosmic framework. They were simply killed, the way that vast and indifferent forces kill people who happen to be in their way. Caleb survived, not saved, not protected, not the recipient of any divine grace. Just overlooked, left alive in the ruins while the forces of chaos moved on to whatever was next on their terrible agenda. The emotional experience of those ruins is one that Malal feeds on specifically and directly. It is not rage exactly, though rage is present in it. It is not grief exactly, though grief is there too. It is the specific and hollow feeling that comes when you have been destroyed by something so much more powerful than you that it did not even bother to notice you. When the forces responsible for your suffering treated you as irrelevant. When the universe expressed, through the medium of violence, that the things you loved and the person you were and the life you had built amounted to nothing that any of the powers operating at scale found interesting enough to engage with. It is the feeling of cosmic irrelevance, of having been dismissed, and it burns in a particular way that other painful feelings do not. Malal finds Caleb in that feeling, arrives there in the way that the dark things in the Warhammer universe always arrive, in the space between consciousness and the void that extreme suffering creates, in the moment when the mind is most receptive to anything that offers a direction and makes an offer. Not Sinchi's elaborate promises of knowledge and destiny, not Nurgle's warm invitation to stop resisting and be embraced, not the straightforward and blood-soaked contract of Khorne, where violence is both the currency and the commodity. Malal's offer is quieter than any of these, almost conversational in its simplicity. Serve me, worship me, and I will give you what you actually want. What Caleb actually wants, what is crystallized in those ruins into the clearest and most honest desire he has ever had, is vengeance. Not justice in any philosophical sense. Not the restoration of what was taken from him. Not healing. The cold and specific satisfaction of making the things that did this to him understand what it costs when you do this to someone. He accepts. The weapon Malal gives him is extraordinary. The Dread Axe. A massive, living daemon weapon whose head is shaped like a pterodactyl carved in bone, mounted on a shaft that feels like the femur of something too large to exist comfortably in any world that considers itself healthy. The weapon houses a portion of the soul of some great cosmic being, bound inside the physical form against its will, unable to escape or dissolve, forced to serve as the engine of a weapon it cannot refuse to be. When the dread axe strikes, its jaw closes, and its teeth bite not into flesh and muscle and bone, but into the soul stuff of whatever it has hit. It does not merely wound, it consumes. It drinks the spiritual substance of what it touches, and what it most hungers to consume is demonic essence, the spiritual material of the very creatures that serve the four great chaos gods. It was designed for this purpose. Malal made it for this purpose. Caleb Dark was not sent into the world to kill mortal humans, or to conquer cities, or to gather territory or power. He was sent to find the champions of the other gods and devour what they most value: their souls, their accumulated essence, the spiritual substance that had been built up through service and suffering and violent devotion to a different patron. Every kill feeds both the weapon and its master feeds the god. The visual design of Caleb Dark is striking in a way that has proven durable across 40 years. His armor is all black, with white detailing. His shield bears the symbol of his god, a skull split perfectly down the center, one half white and one half black. He rides a black chaos steed, a demonic horse faster and fiercer than anything natural, that fights with its own ferocity separate from its riders. And Caleb himself, in the illustrations, appears pale, drained, unnervingly lacking in the robust vitality that warriors are supposed to project. The contact with Malal costs him something physical and ongoing. His pallor is not aesthetic. It is the visible evidence of a transaction that never stops. His battle cry, delivered in the comics with a cheerful precision that somehow makes it more disturbing than rage would, is simple and perfect. Dreadaxe thirsts for you. The thirst is not his. The Dreadaxe has its own desire, its own hunger, its own relationship with what it is about to do. It is not an inert object that Caleb directs. It is a participant, a partner in the violence, something that wants this as much as or more than the hand that holds it. The comic story across its 3 published installments is one of escalating ambition. In the first, published in 1985, Caleb is fighting at the Siege of Prague, that great battle from Warhammer fantasy lore, confronting Khornate warriors and crossing paths with the Skaven, temporarily aligned with the forces of law, because his specific goals sometimes produce outcomes that benefit those who oppose chaos more broadly. This temporary alignment is one of the most interesting structural things about him. He is not good. He does not value what good values. But he can work alongside good because his enemy is also good's enemy, and the specific method by which he fights that enemy happens to reduce the threat level for everyone. In the second installment, titled The Godslayer, and published in the spring of 1986, the story expands. Rules are published for using Caleb Dark in actual games. Miniatures are produced. He becomes not just a narrative concept, but a playable presence in the hobby, something people could put on the table and engage with directly. The title, The Godslayer, signals ambition. This was not a story about fighting human-scale opponents. This was a champion explicitly positioned as something capable of threatening divine beings. The third installment, Evil of the Warpstone, published in spring 1987, introduces 2 antagonist characters, the Chaos Brothers, Jake and Hellwood, explicitly servants of the other gods sent to stop the damage that Malal's champion has been doing to their operations. The story escalates. The danger escalates. A 4th installment was advertised, God Amok, the title that tells you exactly what the climax was building toward. It was never published. The reason it was never published had nothing to do with creative merit. Nothing to do with fan interest. Nothing to do with any internal decision about the direction of the lore. It had to do with who owned what. Wagner and Grant were freelancers. They were not employees of Games Workshop. They were writers contracted to produce content for Games Workshop publications, and under the terms of that arrangement, and under the legal framework governing creator ownership in British publishing at the time, the characters they created belonged to them, not to Games Workshop. This was not unusual. Many of the writers and artists contributing to 2000 AD and other British comics publications during this era retained creator ownership of their characters as a matter of standard practice, the result of a creative community that was aware of the value of its work and careful about who it gave permanent rights to. Wagner and Grant were part of that community, and the agreements they reached with Games Workshop reflected the standard of their industry. For a while, this created no problem. Games Workshop used the characters, printed the comics, produced the miniatures, benefited commercially from the creative work that Wagner and Grant had done. The relationship worked. Then it stopped working. The precise details of what went wrong are not fully public, and the people involved have been appropriately circumspect. What is clear from the available evidence is that at some point, the commercial relationship reached a point where Games Workshop's desire to continue using Malal and Caleb Dark required a licensing arrangement that they were not willing to pay for, so the characters had to go. Rick Priestley, one of the foundational design figures at Games Workshop during this era, has commented on this in interviews. He noted that Malal had been created for the comic without much reference to the established Chaos God structure, that from the Games Workshop side, it had always been somewhat adjacent to the main mythology rather than integral to it. Whether this framing was entirely accurate or served partly as retroactive justification for an uncomfortable decision, the practical outcome was the same. The character was removed from future publications. The name was not to be used. And in 1988, when the Great Realm of Chaos hardback sourcebooks arrived, those lavish and enormously influential volumes that defined Chaos aesthetics and mythology for a generation of players, Malal was simply absent. No narrative explanation, no in-universe death, no statement of any kind, just an empty space where the renegade god had been, as clean and as complete as a name that has been carefully removed from every record that contained it. He had been erased by the very forces of law and commerce that he, in his fictional existence, had declared himself the enemy of. The irony, when you sit with it, is almost too perfect to be accidental. Games Workshop could not use Malal, but they could not afford to leave the conceptual space he occupied completely empty, because that space was real and meaningful. It addressed something structurally important about how the setting worked, and the absence of anything in it created a noticeable gap for anyone paying attention to the theology of chaos. What they did, in response, was split the concept. Malal had represented several things simultaneously. The self-destructive tendency of chaos turned inward, the anarchy that exists when a system is allowed to take its own principles to their logical conclusion, the paradox of a divine being whose fundamental nature works against the interests of divine beings. The specific emotional experience of hatred turned against a structure one is part of. It is very difficult to replace all of that with a single concept, so they did not try. They invented two separate entities to cover the territory, each capturing one dimension of what Malal had been, neither capturing all of it. Zuvasin, called the Undoer or the Great Undoer, embodies the chaos of things falling apart. Not dramatic collapse, not the catastrophic failure that comes from great forces in genuine opposition. The mundane, grinding, infuriating experience of plans dissolving for no particularly good reason. The carefully constructed arrangement that encounters the one specific obstacle it was not designed for. The project that was going perfectly until it was not. Zuvasin is Murphy's Law, given divine form. He ensures that the worst possible failure mode is always the one that activates. He is the god of the dropped coffee cup, the missed connection, the contract that contained the wrong date, the ritual that was interrupted by a side effect nobody anticipated. He does not discriminate between his followers' plans and his enemies' plans. This is the most interesting and most genuinely Malal-esque quality he retained. He is as likely to undermine a ceremony being conducted in his own honor as he is to undermine the scheming of a Tsientian sorcerer. He does not have preferences about outcomes. He only has a preference for dissolution. The thing that makes him interesting, and the thing that makes him obviously inadequate as a replacement for Malal, is that this makes him essentially impossible to worship with any confidence. His followers approach him with the specific faith of people who believe in something they know will fail them, who persist in devotion, precisely because they have accepted that devoting themselves to Zuvasin means devoting themselves to the guarantee of their own plans coming undone. There is honestly something admirable about that level of commitment to a cause that is definitionally self-defeating. Nekaho, the doubter, is the paradox god of atheism. He is the divine embodiment of the refusal to believe in the divine. He feeds on the psychic energy of people who deny the existence of supernatural forces, who look at the available evidence and decide it is insufficient, who maintain their rational skepticism in a universe where gods demonstrably exist and are demonstrably eating people's souls on a daily basis. He works to dissolve religious movements, to introduce doubt into systems of faith, to accomplish, through the slow corrosion of belief, what armies accomplish through direct violence. He knows he is a paradox. He is a god who exists because enough people disbelieved in gods to generate a divine being. He knows this. He has presumably always known this, insofar as a being born from disbelief could be said to have any continuous conscious experience of time. And he wears, reportedly, a permanent expression of ironic amusement, because the only response to being the walking embodiment of an inherent logical contradiction is to find it funny. Both Zuvasin and Nekaho first appeared in the Enemy Within campaign for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay's first edition, in an adventure module called Something Rotten in Kislev. Both have received sporadic canonical acknowledgments in subsequent publications, including a significant explicit statement in the Tome of Salvation supplement for 2nd edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay that described both of them as aspects of an unknown deity, which is precisely as close as Games Workshop has ever officially gotten to admitting that these two entities are Malal fragments. The phrase, aspects of an unknown deity, deserves to be held and examined. It is very carefully chosen. Games Workshop could not say the name. They could not describe the entity those aspects belong to, but they could acknowledge, in language precise enough to be meaningful and vague enough to be deniable, that Zuvasin and Nekaho were not whole and independent gods, but pieces of something that their individual domains did not fully capture, something unknown, something that cannot be named, something that exists in the conceptual negative space created by the naming of everything else. If that sounds familiar, it should. That is Malal's situation in the real world, described in the fictional world, an unnamed deity, an unknown entity. Something that the people around it know exists, but cannot bring themselves to name directly. The renegade god persists, even in the system designed to replace him, present in the gap around which the replacements were built. Neither Zuvasin nor Nekaho is Malal. Neither captures the quality that made Malal genuinely terrifying to the other Chaos gods, specifically, and not just broadly disruptive or philosophically interesting. The specific quality that made Malal dangerous was not the chaos he created in the plans of mortals, or the doubt he introduced into religious systems. It was the direct and active and militantly pursued opposition to the other gods themselves. He had champions. Real champions. Warriors specifically armed, and sent out specifically to find the greatest servants of Khorne and Nurgle and Siench and Slanesh and kill them. He was not an indirect or background force. He was a direct one, pointed at the most powerful beings in the universe, with a weapon designed specifically to hurt them. Zuvasin and Nekaho are interesting concepts, but they are solutions to a legal problem, and that origin shows in the work. They feel like what they are, careful proxies. Close, but not quite approximations. Adequate replacements for a specific function in the machinery of the setting that are genuinely inadequate as replacements for the full thing they were designed to cover. The god that Malal represented did not disappear when his name was removed from the publications. The concept of chaos turning on itself, of a divine embodiment of self-destructive force growing stronger as the other gods grow stronger, of followers who serve something they hate in order to destroy something they hate more. These are real and persistent elements of the emotional landscape that generates the warp. They do not go away because a legal dispute removed the most direct expression of them from the canon. They simply exist without a fully realized representative, waiting in the conceptual space they had always occupied, until something else gives them form. That something else arrived in 2002, and it wore a different name. The year is 2002. Warhammer 40,000 is deep in its 3rd edition. Games Workshop is a substantially larger and more sophisticated commercial entity than the company that produced those original Citadel journals, operating globally, managing a franchise of enormous scope and complexity. The Chaos Space Marines Codex for 3rd edition receives its 2nd version in that year, a substantial production with full army rules, extensive background, and painting guides, showing players the variety of ways they might choose to paint their models. And somewhere in that codex, placed in the section showing alternative color schemes with what appears to be studied and deliberate casualness, is something that will stop a certain kind of reader mid-page. A color scheme, black and white, split down the center of each plate of power armor with the precision of something that has been carefully divided in half. A chapter symbol, a skull, one half white, one half black, sometimes surrounded by the arrows of a chaos star. A name below the illustration, the Sons of Malice. A note that these warriors are a renegade chapter, exiled from the Imperium for rituals reported to include cannibalism, known for fighting in complete silence, notably fierce against other followers of Chaos. Also in that codex, listed among the demonic weapons available to Chaos Marines, is something called the Dread Axe. Its description notes a particular preference for killing demonic entities. The reader who knows what they are looking at will recognize every element of this immediately and absolutely. The color scheme is Malal's color scheme. The symbol is Malal's symbol. The name Malice is one letter away from Malal. The warriors who fight chaos as readily as they fight anyone else are doing precisely what Malal's followers were always described as doing. And the dread axe that hunts daemons is the dread axe that hunted daemons, wearing the same name it always had, described in language that echoes the original lore as clearly as possible without copying it. Games Workshop had found a way back, not by resolving the legal situation, not by reaching a new agreement with Wagner and Grant, not by purchasing the rights or paying the royalties that had originally made the arrangement impossible. They had found a way back through careful renaming, through the application of the creative principle that ideas belong to no one, but specific expressions of ideas can be owned, through the quiet and sophisticated navigation of a legal space that had seemed closed. Every element is different enough that no direct infringement claim could plausibly succeed. Malice is not Malal. The Sons of Malice are not Caleb Dark. A demonic weapon called a Dread Axe that kills other daemons is not the specific Dread Axe that belonged to Caleb Dark, but the totality of the package communicates, with perfect clarity to anyone paying attention, exactly what has happened and what this is. The Renegade God is back. He is wearing a different suit, traveling under a different passport, but he is the same entity, with the same nature, and the same followers, and the same weapons, and the same sacred colors, and the same sacred number. White Dwarf magazine soon provided more substantial lore. The Index Astartes article, Rogue Sons, Renegade Space Marine Chapters, gave the chapter proper treatment. And the picture that assembled from these sources was not merely a reintroduction of an old concept, but a genuine expansion, a full and coherent history for a Space Marine chapter, whose story illuminated the Malice concept in ways that the original fragmentary Malal lore never had the opportunity to do. The Sons of Malice had been loyal, once. That cannot be overstated in understanding them. Their original name is gone from every imperial record, but the record of their loyalty was real. The centuries of dedicated service to the Imperium against the very chaos forces that now share the Eye of Terror with them. They were among the 20 Space Marine chapters known as the Astartes Praises, founded specifically to guard the regions surrounding the Eye of Terror. This was not ceremonial posting or administrative assignment. It was the most dangerous duty a Space Marine chapter could be given. Centuries of standing watch against the most concentrated and persistent chaos presence in the galaxy. Centuries of paying the blood price of that vigil repeatedly and without complaint. They did this. They paid this price. They gave themselves to this service. They had customs, as every Space Marine chapter does, shaped by the world they came from, by the cultures they recruited from, by the specific emotional and spiritual logic of their particular history. Their homeworld of Celis was a feral world, home to tattooed and cannibalistic tribal cultures whose relationship with violence and sustenance and the sacred was built from thousands of years of living in a brutal environment and making meaning from that brutality. The Sons inherited those customs. They adapted them into chapter traditions. They made them their own. Among those traditions were rituals involving flesh, involving the consumption of certain categories of defeated enemy, involving the number 11 as a sacred organizing principle for ceremony and hierarchy and spiritual obligation, involving practices that, to an observer unfamiliar with the full range of Space Marine chapter customs, looked extremely like heresy. An inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus named Solomon Pietas, apparently unfamiliar with the fact that the omophagia, the organ that allows space marines to absorb genetic memories through consumption of biological material, was designed specifically to encourage cannibalistic behavior, and apparently also unfamiliar with the fact that numerous Space Marine chapters have traditions that would alarm an uninformed outside observer, but that are recognized as legitimate chapter practice by the Imperium, observed one of the Sun's victory celebrations. She concluded that what she was witnessing was unambiguous chaos heresy. She organized a strike force of Adepta Sororitas Celestians and assaulted the chapter's homeworld during the celebration. The response of the Sons of Malice to this assault was not measured. The Sisters of Battle were defeated with a thoroughness that suggested the chapter had not been unprepared for the attack, or perhaps simply that the fury of warriors defending their sacred rights from unexpected attack is a specific and extreme kind of fury. And then, First Captain Cathal, having defeated the Inquisitor's strike force, did what his chapter traditions sanctioned for the most significant defeated enemies. He sacrificed her, and then he consumed her. In the manner his traditions had always designated for such occasions, the Imperium declared the Sons of Malice excommunicate traitoris. The Cadian 331st Regiment was dispatched to Celis and conducted a systematic genocide of every tribal population the Sons had ever recruited from. Celis was declared perdita, a world under permanent condemnation. Every trace of the chapter's original name was removed from every imperial record that contained it. They fled into the eye of terror, into the place they had spent centuries guarding against, into the realm of the very powers they had given everything to contain. And in that churning space, where the immaterium bleeds through the fabric of reality, where the great chaos god's domains brush against real space through the wound that Slaaneish's birth tore in the universe, the Sons found something that had been waiting for them. Not the four great gods offering their standard terms of service, something different, something that matched their emotional register with a precision that felt less like chance and more like recognition. Malice, the outcast, the one who had also been expelled from the structure he was part of, the one who also burned with a cold and specific hatred, directed equally at the Imperium that created him and the chaos gods that rejected him, the one who existed in the spaces between the acknowledged powers, feeding on their surplus, growing on their overflow. The Sons of Malice did not fall to chaos in the way that falling to chaos is usually described. They did not succumb to temptation. They were not seduced by promises of power or pleasure or change or sensation. They did not lose themselves gradually in the service of something beautiful that revealed itself to be monstrous. They chose, with full awareness and cold deliberation, to serve the entity that best represented what they were and what they had become. They were betrayed servants, and Malice is the god of betrayed servants. They hated both the Imperium that destroyed them and the chaos structure that offered them nothing they wanted. Malice hates both the Imperium of man and every other chaos god with equal and structural conviction. They existed outside every recognized framework, with nowhere to go, and no patron who would have them. Malice exists outside every recognized framework, in the spaces between the established domains, belonging to no alliance and recognized by no authority. When the Sons found Malice, they were not converted. They were recognized. The Sons of Malice deserve real and extended attention. They are genuinely unlike any other faction in the full breadth of Warhammer 40,000, and their strangeness is not superficial, not merely aesthetic, but goes into the deepest level of what they are and what they do and what they value. Begin with the silence, because the silence is where everything else starts. Space Marines are not quiet. This is not simply a matter of tactical noise discipline or the ambient sound of combat. Space Marine culture is built on liturgy and declaration, and the articulation of faith under pressure. Chaplains recite prayers and litanies through Vox systems at volume as battles unfold, not because the sound serves a tactical purpose, but because the sound serves a spiritual one, because the declaration of faith in the midst of danger is itself the act of faith. Veterans bellow oaths of moment before engaging. Assault Marines scream as they close. Even the most reserved and disciplined chapters make noise, because the human nervous system, under extreme stress, generates sound as a byproduct of function, and Space Marines, for all their transformation, carry the echo of that tendency. The Sons of Malice fight in total silence. They do not speak during combat. They do not shout when they charge. They do not cry out when they are hit. They do not roar when they land a blow. The sounds of the battle exist around them, as they always do, bolters and explosions, and the screaming of enemies, and the constant terrible percussion of violence. But from the Sons themselves, there is nothing. Their voices have been removed from the battlefield as precisely as a craftsman removes excess material from something being made precise. The effect on those who encounter them is documented specifically in the lore as disquieting in a way that goes beyond tactical assessment. Regular soldiers lose a reference point they did not know they were relying on. The sounds of the people fighting you tell you things about their emotional state, their level of confidence, whether they are struggling or succeeding, whether they are human in some recognizable way. The Sons of Malice provide none of this information. They advance without announcement. They fight without commentary. Their silence is a form of information denial, a way of making themselves illegible to everyone who encounters them. Other Space Marines find it particularly alien. Even those chapters that observe significant tactical silence in combat tend to make some noise at significant moments. In response to significant events, the Sons respond to nothing with sound. Nothing appears to move them enough to vocalize it. Other Chaos Space Marines, who are in general extremely difficult to unsettle, find it more threatening than any war cry, because at least a war cry tells you something about what you are facing. The Sons' silence tells you nothing, except that whatever is behind those black and white helmets has decided that sound is a resource not worth spending on you. When they communicate with each other, they use whispers. Not for tactical concealment, but as a matter of settled habit and, one suspects, theological preference. The whisper is the register of the thing that does not want to be overheard, the register of secrets. The register of things being passed between people who have decided to keep them from the world at large. Their relationship with the number 11 is total and pervasive. 11 companies, not the 10 the Codex Astartes specifies. 11 champions in their highest honor class. 11 survivors from each centennial challenge. Their sacred feast of 1,000 captives, conducted every 100 years, consuming exactly 1,100 bodies, if the pattern holds. 100 for each of the 11 chosen. Their entire existence is organized around the number that is sacred to their god. The challenge of the labyrinth is the center of their cultic life, the defining ceremony of who they are and what they have become. Every 100 years, the entire chapter gathers aboard what was once their battle barge, a vessel that has over the millennium of their exile been drawn into and fused with other derelict ships until it has become a space hulk of significant scale, designated the Labyrinth. The ship has been absorbing warp energies for 1,000 years. It has been accumulating the organic and inorganic detritus of 10 centuries of warp exposure, and it has been keeping, in its dark interior, the transformed remnants of those who entered previous challenges and did not emerge. Before the challenge begins, the ritual feast takes place. 1,000 captives, gathered from across the galaxy over the preceding century, consumed with ceremonial precision. This is not presented in the lore as orgiastic excess or blood-soaked frenzy. It is a ritual with structure and protocol. It is conducted with the same precise and unemotional method the Sons bring to everything. Then, the candidates enter the labyrinth. They carry nothing. No weapons brought from outside. No supplies provided. They go in with what they can find inside, whatever the ship has accumulated, and left accessible to someone desperate and capable enough to locate and repurpose it. They fight through whatever the ship has produced in the 100 years since the last challenge, through warp-mutated creatures and alien intrusions, and the drifting remnants of the ship's own terrible history, and through the previous failures, because the labyrinth does not clean itself. The people who entered previous challenges and did not survive are still there, transformed by the warp energies that saturate every surface of the ship, made into something that is no longer entirely themselves, but that is not entirely something else either. Former human beings, former space marines even, now constituting the most specific and most personal category of hazard in the entire trial. To become a doomed one, you must defeat, among other things, the things that defeated the people who came before you. 11 survive, always exactly 11. This consistency is either the result of the trial being constructed with that specific target in mind, or the result of Malus himself ensuring that his sacred number is served, that the mathematics of his worship always resolve correctly. The lore does not specify which. Both are consistent with the renegade god's nature. The chapter's relationships with all factions outside itself are organized by a single principle: hostility. The depth and nature of that hostility varies by category of target. Their hatred of the Imperium is a 1,000-year thing, settled and structural and architectural, rather than hot and immediate. The specific soldiers who conducted the genocide on Celis are dead. The Inquisitor who triggered the cascade is dead. The High Lords who approved the excommunication are dead. 1,000 years of the Imperium's endless churn of administration and warfare have put many generations between the suns and anyone personally responsible for what was done to them. It does not matter. They hate the institution, not the individuals. They hate what the Imperium is and what it does and what it represents. A structure that claims to value loyal service and destroys that service when it becomes inconvenient. In the aftermath of Cadia's fall, when the 13th Black Crusade scattered the Cadians across the stars as refugees, the Sons of Malus appeared in their path. Not because the refugees were militarily significant, not because attacking, fleeing civilians and broken soldiers served any strategic purpose, because the Cadian 331st Regiment killed their people. Because the regiment's world is gone now, but the grudge remains, and the people who carry that history deserve to feel what it cost. 1,000 years of patience, then the moment arrives, then they act. Their equal hostility to the other Chaos factions is what truly sets them apart from every other Renegade chapter in the setting. Most chapters that fall from Imperial grace eventually find some accommodation with the Chaos power structure. Even the most independent traitor warbands tend to operate within the broad framework of Chaos Undivided, or align themselves with one of the four great gods. The Sons of Malus do not. They attack Khornate warriors. They attack Nurgle's cultists. They attacked Saenchkian sorcerers. They attack Slaaneish's devotees. Their vehicles are decorated with the helmets of slain Chaos champions, displayed specifically as statements of intent, evidence that they went looking for those champions and found them and won. They are enemies of everyone. They make no alliances. They accept no accommodations. They exist in a state of perpetual war against the universe that rejected them, and that war has no preferred target, no hierarchy of enemies, no moment when they decide that they have fought enough. They are, in this complete and cold and uncompromising way, exactly what their god made them. For most of its existence in Warhammer 40,000, Malus was a background presence, named but not shown, referenced but not dramatized. The lore acknowledged that he existed somewhere in the immaterium, that his followers served him and feared him and would not speak his name too loud, that his power grew as the other gods' power grew, that his warriors fought everyone, including each other's rivals, and sometimes each other's predecessors, and occasionally just each other in the service of the god's unknowable agenda. But Malus himself, the entity, the divine being, the thing with eyes of fire that the Sons of Malus worshipped and sacrificed for, and organized their entire existence around, remained off-page, always implied, always approaching, always the promise of a reveal that had not yet come. That changed in 2010. A short story called The Labyrinth was published in a Black Library anthology titled Heroes of the Space Marines. The author was Richard Ford, and the story it told was the most direct and most detailed engagement with the subject of Malus that any official Games Workshop publication had ever attempted. The story centers on the Sons of Malus during one of their centennial challenges. We follow a group of candidates through the gathering and the feast and into the labyrinth itself, through its dark and broken corridors with their warp-corrupted air and their accumulated centuries of violence and death. The narrative is intimate and specific, following individual warriors through the challenge, with the kind of attention to their inner lives that good short fiction can provide. What the story does that earlier lore had not done is make the candidates human, not sympathetic in the way that protagonists of heroic fiction are sympathetic, but human. They are afraid. They are capable of loyalty. They cooperate tactically with each other, even under circumstances designed to divide them. They have histories with each other that inform how they behave. They are warriors who were space marines before they were sons of malice, and that history is present in how they move and think and respond to threat. And then the labyrinth claims most of them. 11 survive. Those 11 gather with the chapter, the gathered doomed ones, the finest the chapter has produced in a century of preparation. And the final ritual begins. Anarch Cathal performs the summoning. The doomed ones are consumed by black light, their forms dissolved, their substance released. 11 warriors given entirely to the entity they have spent their lives serving, given in the most absolute sense. Nothing retained. No body, no soul, nothing, that continues to exist as itself after the giving. And what stands in the great hall when it is done is this, in the direct words of the story, the revenant they had worshipped for millennia, the eidolon that would stand at their vanguard as they retook what was rightfully theirs. He could only be summoned by sacrifice, only by giving unto him their best and most praiseworthy warriors could he walk among them. And there he stood, gazing with eyes of fire, the renegade god, the outcast, the lost, hierarch of anarchy and terror, malice. 2 words in that passage deserve careful attention: revenant and eidolon. A revenant is a spirit that has returned from death, specifically one that returns with purpose, with something unfinished, driven back into presence by something that death itself could not dissolve. The word carries the implication that malice is not simply present, but returned, that his presence in the material universe is a restoration of something that was elsewhere and has now been called back. That he exists at a kind of remove from the fully manifested form he might take, if the conditions were right, if the summoning were more complete, if the sacrifice were even greater. An eidolon is a shade or phantom in the classical Greek sense, a supernatural image of something, a shard or fragment dispatched from a greater whole, not the thing itself, but a genuine portion of it, capable of acting, capable of presence, real in the specific sense that it occupies space and has effects, but not the entirety of what it represents. These words suggest that what the sons of malice summoned was not malice in his full divine form. The full divine form of a chaos god is an entity of cosmic scale, present throughout its domain in the warp, in ways that preclude the kind of focused physical manifestation in real space that the story describes. What was summoned was something more mobile, more focused, more able to exist at a scale that the material universe can contain. A shard, an avatar. The piece of malice that can walk among mortals without the totality of what he is tearing the local fabric of reality by the mere fact of presence. This has implications. The most interesting one is that it differentiates malice from the other 4 great gods in a way that makes him more rather than less threatening in a specific operational sense. The other 4 great gods do not manifest in the material universe. They act through daemons, through champions, through the corruption they spread in mortal hearts. Their full forms exist only in the warp. Malice, apparently, can be called through into physical presence, given sufficient sacrifice and sufficient ritual preparation. Whether this makes him weaker because it suggests he is smaller than the others and can fit himself into a more limited form, or whether it makes him differently powerful, able to be present in ways the others cannot, is a question the lore deliberately leaves open. What is not open is the emotional reality of the moment. The chapter gathered in silence, their god present, physical, real. Everything they had spent 1,000 years of exile and devotion and sacrifice and ritual building toward, standing before them with eyes of fire. After The Labyrinth was published, Games Workshop drew back again. Subsequent publications featuring the Sons of Malice made no further reference to the entity introduced in the short story. The number 11 remained sacred, the black and white heraldry remained unchanged. But the god himself retreated once more into the spaces between the official descriptions. He returned to where he lives, to the places the lore does not quite reach, to the silence between the sentences, to the tomb of space where his laughter fills the empty distances between things that are named. There is a mystery at the center of Warhammer 40,000's oldest and deepest lore that has been maintained with extraordinary consistency across every iteration of the setting, across decades of novels and rulebooks and campaign supplements and sourcebooks, across every major narrative event from the Horus Heresy to the fall of Cadia to the Great Rift and everything in between. 20 Space Marine legions. The Emperor made 20. 9 fell to chaos. 9 remained loyal. 2 are missing. Their designations were the 2nd and the 11th. Their names have been removed from every available Imperial record. The Primarchs who led them are not discussed even by characters who should have known them personally, whose lives overlapped with theirs during the Great Crusade, because those characters find that their memories of those beings have been somehow altered or suppressed. The Legion's warriors were absorbed into other formations, their gene seed diluted or redirected, their histories buried under the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of Imperial record management. This mystery has been maintained since the early days of Warhammer 40,000. Games Workshop established it, and has tended to it carefully through every subsequent development of the setting, dropping occasional hints that immediately generate thousands of words of community analysis while never providing answers. The missing legions are a deliberate wound in the mythology, and that wound has been kept open and kept precise across decades of creative work. The community has developed many theories about what happened to the 2nd and 11th legions. Various arguments place them as noble sacrifices, as beings too corrupted even for the traitor legions, as Primarchs who discovered something about the Emperor that was too dangerous to allow to be widely known, as victims of the Rangdan xenocides, as entities whose fate is deliberately left for players to imagine rather than being canonically specified. And then there is the theory involving Malus. Malus's sacred number is 11. This is documented clearly and consistently in every source that discusses his lore. His followers organize their rituals, their hierarchy, their sacred obligations around the number 11. 11 doomed ones, 11 companies, 11, 11, 11. The missing 11th Legion's Primarch was expunged from history. Their warriors were dissolved into other formations. Their fate is described only as too secret to be discussed. The theory: the 11th Legion did not fall to chaos in the way the 9 traitor legions fell. They did not succumb to the seductive power of Khorne or Nurgle or Tsencha or Slaanesh. They were not corrupted through temptation or gradually consumed by the forces they were sworn to fight. They fell in an entirely different direction, toward the entity that opposes the ruinous powers from within the same fundamental category of being. They became, through a process the lore does not provide materials to specify, servants of Malus. This would explain why their records were expunged, not because they became traitors in the conventional sense, not because they turned against the Emperor in the way the 9 traitors did, but because they became something stranger and more cosmologically complicated than traitors. They became warriors in a different war, one the Imperium had no theological framework for understanding or acknowledging. Their Primarch, whoever he was, may have been the first contact point, or may have been drawn in after the fact, but his fate is something the Emperor could not allow to be discussed, because the existence of an anti-chaos, chaos god, commanding Space Marine legions, creates problems that the Imperium's theology cannot resolve without extensive and potentially destabilizing revision. The Sons of Malus, in this theory, are not a recently fallen chapter with an unfortunate history. They are the modern remnant of the 11th Legion's gene seed lineage, carrying in their biology and their traditions and their sacred number 11, the echo of what the missing legion was and what was done to it. The Horus Heresy novel series provides a moment that the theory specifically draws on. In a confrontation scene of significance, Horus attempts to say something before being prevented from completing it. What emerges sounds like the beginning of a name, Mal, and then separately, Al. The community immediately noticed the potential significance, Malal, the renegade god's original name, spoken by Horus, in extremis, in a situation where anything he says must be presumed significant. Games Workshop has said nothing definitive about this. The ambiguity is almost certainly intentional. The theory fits. It does not require any established element of the lore to be false. The number 11 in both the Malus lore and the Missing Legion lore is the hardest piece of evidence, and while it is not conclusive, it is not nothing. The Sons of Malus's claimed pre-renegade identity as an organization already calling themselves by that name suggests a connection to Malus that predates their official fall from grace. The Astartes praises founding, allows for the theoretical use of unusual or obscure gene seed sources. All of these threads point in the same direction, without any of them constituting proof. The best mysteries in fiction are the ones that reward sustained attention without providing easy answers. The holes in the mythology that can be filled meaningfully. The spaces where the evidence points towards something consistent, even though the evidence cannot be called conclusive. Malice and the missing 11th Legion together create exactly this kind of mystery. A space in the lore where a specific and internally coherent theory can exist without being contradicted by anything that has been written. Whether it is true, in the sense of being what Games Workshop actually intends, may never be confirmed. The missing Primarchs are among the setting's most carefully maintained mysteries, but the theory is elegant, and elegance is worth something in a fictional universe this large. We have come a long way together through this story. From a 1,985 hobby publication and 2 legendary comics writers, through the soul-drinking acts of a pale and doomed champion, through the legal machinery that erased a god from a fictional universe, through the grinding logic of contracts and ownership, through the careful and clever reintroduction of the same concept, wearing a different name, through the space marines who eat people and fight in silence and have been waging cold and patient war against everyone for 1,000 years, through the one published moment when a god with eyes of fire manifested in physical reality and his children gathered in silence to receive him. Why does any of this matter? The question is worth asking honestly. Malice is not a major faction. He does not drive the central narrative of the setting in the way that the Great Black Crusades do, or the arrival of the Tyranid fleets, or the splitting of the galaxy by the Great Rift. He is a footnote, a renegade, a small god whose legal status makes full development impossible, and whose canonical presence has always been partial, marginal, carefully managed. Why does the community keep caring about him? Part of the answer is purely aesthetic. The visual concept is extraordinary. Black and white, split with geometric precision, is not the palette of chaos, as most people encounter it. It does not have the saturated blood color of Khorne's domain, or the warm decay yellows of Nurgle, or the fractured iridescent complexity of Tsiench, or the rich excess of Slaanesh. It looks like something that has stripped away everything that is not necessary for precise communication of what it is, a divided thing. A thing that exists in the tension between its two halves without resolving into either. An aesthetic that is not attempting to seduce or overwhelm, but simply to state. The Sons of Malice on a Warhammer tabletop cannot be mistaken for anything else. They do not blend with the surrounding visual environment. They are precisely themselves, in exactly the way that their theology demands. Part of the answer is narrative uniqueness. In a setting defined by the war between order and chaos, between the Imperium's cold and sometimes monstrous order and the Warp's hot and always monstrous chaos, Malice occupies a position that is not reducible to either side. He does not want the Chaos Gods to win. He does not want the Imperium to win. He wants the conflict itself to end in the most total possible way. Through the consumption of both sides, by the forces they have unleashed, through the universe's own tendency toward entropy, finally catching up with even the most powerful things in it. This is not nihilism in the shallow sense. It is something more precise, more philosophically developed than the simple absence of values. It is the recognition that chaos, taken to its ultimate conclusion in any direction, is self-defeating. That power turned inward is the most dangerous power. That the very forces the four great gods represent will eventually produce the conditions for their own destruction, not because someone defeats them, but because they are, by their nature, self-consuming. In a setting defined by the grim darkness of the far future, by the certainty that things will not improve, and the only question is how bad they will get, there is something almost honest about a god who has taken that truth to its furthest implication. Not endure, not serve, not conquer or corrupt or change or indulge. Just everything ends. The war ends. The gods end. The universe ends. And when everything ends, he laughs, because this was always what it was heading toward, and he is the only one who was honest about it. Part of the answer is the way the real-world story mirrors the fictional one. The legal dispute that killed Malal, the erasing of his name from the canon, his reintroduction under a new identity, his existence in the margins rather than the center, being present in the hints and the color schemes and the sacred numbers rather than in explicit and direct representation. All of this mirrors the in-universe story of the renegade god with a precision that almost seems designed. He was cast out. His name was removed from the records. He exists now in the spaces between the officially acknowledged things, growing on the overflow of the system that expelled him, present everywhere and acknowledged nowhere. The real-world history and the fictional mythology have become one story. The god who embodies being expelled from a structure and growing stronger in exile is himself an entity that was expelled from a fictional structure and has grown stronger in whatever form of exile that means for a creative concept. Part of the answer is possibility. Malice represents the road not taken. The version of the chaos setting that has a genuine internal opposition, a third position that is not reducible to order or chaos, a force of self-destructive anarchy that serves neither the Imperium nor the ruinous powers, but opposes both with equal and unconditional commitment. If he were ever fully developed, ever given the canonical presence his conceptual richness deserves, he would change the emotional register of every conflict in the setting by introducing a perspective that currently exists only in the margins. That potential, that possibility of a different shape for the story that is always present but never fully realized, is itself a form of presence. He is defined by his absence as much as by what has been written about him. The hole he leaves in the canonical structure is shaped exactly like him. The laughter of the outcast god fills the tomb of space. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the endless churning of powers, too vast and too ancient to be comprehended by individual mortal minds, where the Imperium grinds forward on faith and blood and the momentum of 10,000 years, where the Chaos Gods pursue their eternal game with no endgame that any mortal could survive witnessing, where Xenos and Tyranids and Necrons and all the other categories of threat pile against the fragile lights of human civilization without pause or mercy, there is one entity that looks at all of it and finds it darkly funny. Not because it does not matter, because it matters in exactly the way that all things ultimately matter, which is to say that it will all be consumed by the thing that has been growing on its edges since the first moment it began. And the thing growing on its edges is him, and when the consumption is complete, there will be nothing, not even him, and that nothing will be the universe finally telling the truth about itself. He is the renegade god. He is Malice. He is the chaos god that nobody knows, the one whispered in fear, even in the darkest places of the warp, the one who was erased and came back, the one who exists in the margins and grows on the overflow. The sons of Malice, black and white and silent, know his name. They do not say it at volume. They pass it between themselves in whispers, the way you pass something fragile, the way you handle something that cuts. They are his children. They are his weapons. They are the proof that even in a universe that claims to have no room for a fifth god, the fifth god finds a way. He is always there. In the spaces between the light, in the silence between the sounds of war, in the pause before the next terrible thing begins. The void between the stars is very dark and very cold, and the god who lives in that cold is laughing. He has always been laughing. If you stayed with this all the way to here, you are exactly the reason I make these videos. The deep-cut stuff, the forgotten corners, the gods erased by paperwork, and the Space Marines who responded to being declared heretics by eating the Inquisitor who declared them, and genuinely believing that was a proportionate response. This is the lore that lives in the quiet and rewards the people willing to stay quiet long enough to hear it. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think about Malice and his place in the setting. Do you think Games Workshop should find a way to fully restore him to the canon? Does the connection between the sacred number 11 and the missing 11th Legion feel like intentional design or pattern recognition applied to coincidence? What is your own theory about what happened to the missing Primarchs? What do you think is out there in the Eye of Terror, waiting in the dark with eyes of fire? If you have not subscribed yet, please do. There is so much more to explore together, so many dark corners of this universe that deserve careful attention. Every video I make is an attempt to spend real time with something that rewards real time spent with it. Take care of yourselves out there. The void is very dark, and the god who lives in the dark between things is laughing. Sleep well. Extended section. the nature of malice, in-depth parasitic power, and divine contradiction. There is a passage from a fictional text called the Great Book of Despair, preserved in the fragmentary lore around Malal, and cited in the earliest background material Games Workshop produced for the character, that repays close reading more than almost anything else in the Warhammer theological canon. It reads in part, "And he that went before now came last, and that which was white and black and all direction was thrown against itself. Grown mightily indignant at the words of the gods, Malal did turn his heart against them and flee into the chambers of space. And no man looked to Malal then, save those that serve that which they hate, who smile upon their misfortune, and who bear no love save for the damned. At such times as a warrior's heart turns to Malal, all gods of chaos grow fearful, and the laughter of the outcast god fills the tomb of space." Each sentence of this passage rewards separate examination. Begin with the first. He that went before now came last. The implication of priority, of seniority. Something that was once positioned at the head, or at least early in the sequence, has been repositioned at the end. This is not merely a metaphor for Malal's reduced standing among the Chaos gods. It suggests a history, a position that he once held that has been inverted. He was not always the outcast. He was once part of the structure, perhaps even preceding the others in some sense, that the text does not elaborate but gestures toward. Whatever happened to make him last happened to him specifically. Something was done to him, or something he did, resulted in this inversion of position. That which was white and black and all direction was thrown against itself. His fundamental nature involves direction being turned against itself, movement being converted into counter-movement, force being turned back on its origin. All directions. Not merely one direction reversed, but all of them simultaneously thrown into opposition with each other. This is the visual language of his symbol made explicit in physical metaphor, the skull that is both white and black. The colors that are each other's negation, placed side by side, balanced and therefore unbalanced, stable in their instability, grown mightily indignant at the words of the gods. Something was said. A specific event involving speech or communication among the Chaos gods preceded his departure. He did not simply leave, he reacted. His leaving was a response to something that the other gods did or said, something that struck him as so unacceptable that departure was the only possible answer. The word indignant is interesting here rather than, say, enraged or terrified or despairing. Indignation is the specific emotional response to treatment one considers, beneath one's dignity. To being treated as less than one is entitled to be treated as. He did not leave in fear or in despair. He left in the specific fury of someone who has been insulted at a fundamental level. Malal did turn his heart against them and flee into the chambers of space. Heart, not merely allegiance or power or tactical positioning. Heart. The seat of will and desire in the language of the time, the thing that determines where genuine commitment lies. He did not merely tactically reposition himself. He fundamentally redirected his deepest motivation. The turning of the heart is the permanent change, the thing that cannot be undone by negotiation or accommodation or the passage of time. And then flight into the chambers of space, which is a beautiful phrase for the cold and empty places between things. The vast distances that are not the domain of any particular entity, and that the Chaos gods presumably cannot reach into easily from their immense warp-rooted positions. No man looked to Malal then, save those that serve that which they hate. This is the definition of his worshippers that has no parallel anywhere else in the Chaos theology. Not those who seek power, not those who desire change, not those who accept decay, not those who pursue sensation, those who serve that which they hate. The faith that Malal inspires is built on a foundation that every other religion would consider impossible. You worship what you despise. You give your devotion to the thing you most resent the need to depend on. Your connection to your God is defined not by love or fear, but by a combination of contempt for him and the recognition that he is the only one who will give you what you need to do what you are trying to do. Think about the emotional complexity required to maintain this kind of faith. You have to hold two contradictory orientations toward the same object simultaneously. The practical orientation of a dependent who needs what only this source can provide, and the contemptuous orientation of someone who despises the fact of needing it. Every prayer is a kind of grudging acknowledgement. Every ritual is performed in bad faith in the strictest possible sense. The worship is sincere in its effects, but insincere in its spirit, offered by people who understand exactly what they are giving and to whom they are giving it, and who do it anyway, because the alternative is to abandon the mission that brought them here. At such times as a warrior's heart turns to Malal, all gods of chaos grow fearful. The other gods are afraid of him, not dismissive, not contemptuous, not simply hostile in the way that the four great gods are hostile to each other as competitors for resources and influence, afraid. The specific and active fear that comes when you recognize a genuine threat. And the source of their fear is not Malal's direct power. He almost certainly cannot match any of the four great gods in direct confrontation of raw psychic force. The fear is different from that. It is the fear of something that cannot be accommodated, cannot be brought into the structure, cannot be negotiated with, cannot be made into an ally, even a temporary and unstable one. Every other entity in the warp, including the other three chaos gods, can theoretically be dealt with in terms that involve mutual benefit, or at least mutually acceptable outcomes. Malal cannot. His purpose is their destruction. Not their diminishment or their temporary weakness or their defeat in a specific campaign. Their destruction, full and final, which means the destruction of everything they have built and everything they are made of, and everything their existence has produced. The laughter of the outcast god fills the tomb of space. Not a domain, not a realm, not a palace or a fortress or a garden of decay or a castle of shifting corridors, a tomb. And the sound that fills this vast and empty place where he lives is laughter. Not battle cries or prayers, or the sound of schemes being laid, or pleasures being taken. Laughter. The specific and deeply unnerving sound of something that finds its own situation funny. That has processed the full horror of what it is, and decided that the appropriate response is amusement. There is a kind of courage in that, if the word courage can be applied to something like malice. The other gods take themselves and their purposes with absolute seriousness. Khorne's rage is total and unironic. Nurgle's affection is genuine, however horrifying. Tzeentch's scheming is earnest in the sense that he genuinely believes the schemes matter, that the outcomes of his plots are important to him. Slaaneish's pursuit of sensation is utterly committed, without any of the self-awareness that might make it seem absurd. Malice laughs at everything, including himself. He has looked at what he is and what he is doing and decided that it is, on some level, funny. Not false humor, not irony deployed as a defense mechanism, but the genuine amusement of something that has understood its situation completely, and found in that understanding something that most beings would describe as bleak, and that he describes as hilarious. The god of self-destruction has found his own self-destruction funny. The outcast god has found his own exile funny. The being who grows stronger as the things he opposes grow stronger has found his own parasitic existence funny. Maybe that is the most honest response to being what he is. The alternative is despair, and despair belongs to Nurgle. The alternative is rage, and rage belongs to Khorne. The alternative is scheming, and scheming belongs to Tzeentch. The only emotional register available to something that contains all of these as elements of its nature and resolves them into something that stands apart from all of them is exactly this. The dark humor of something that has seen the joke. The universe is a system that generates the seeds of its own destruction as a byproduct of existing at all. Consciousness generates suffering, generates psychic energy, generates gods, generates chaos, generates malice, generates eventual entropy. The wheel turns and turns, and at the bottom of every turn is the same thing, nothing, and the nothing laughs, and the laughter fills the tomb of space. The other gods are afraid of the laughter because they cannot answer it. They can fight armies. They can seduce champions. They can spread corruption through the careful application of gifts and temptations designed for specific emotional vulnerabilities. They can fight each other in the great game for as long as the universe exists, but they cannot argue with laughter. They cannot make war on amusement. They cannot corrupt something that has already incorporated its own corruption into its nature from the beginning. Malice is the one thing in the warp that the other gods cannot deal with, not because he is stronger than them, because he is the thing they cannot stop being the source of, cannot stop feeding, cannot stop generating, as a consequence of being what they are. He is built into the structure at a level below where their operations happen. He is the tax that chaos pays for existing. Every victory Khorne wins makes malice stronger. Every plague Nurgle spreads makes malice stronger. Every scheme Tzeentch executes makes malice stronger. Every ecstasy Slaanesh induces makes malice stronger. He does not need to do anything to grow. He simply needs to wait, in the cold and the dark, in the chambers of space, while the other gods pursue their natures, and in doing so, inevitably feed the thing that is going to be their undoing. He is patient because he has to be, because the thing he embodies is patient by nature. Entropy is not in a hurry. The slow turning of the universe toward heat death does not rush. The tendency of complex systems to eventually simplify into their lowest energy states does not need to impose a timeline. It just continues, and continues, and continues, until there is nothing left to continue. That is what malice is. That is what he has always been. The most patient and the most inevitable thing in a universe full of patient and inevitable horrors. Extended. Section. The philosophy of Malil's followers. What it means to serve. Let us sit for a while with the specific theology of being a follower of malice. Not the mechanics of service, not the practical details of what rituals are performed and what weapons are carried. The deeper question, what does it actually feel like? Or what might it actually feel like to be a member of the doomed ones? To devote yourself to a god you hate, in pursuit of the destruction of gods you hate more? This is, when you actually examine it, one of the most psychologically sophisticated presentations of religious devotion in the entire Warhammer setting. Every other form of chaos worship is, in some fundamental sense, wish fulfillment. Khorne's followers want to fight and be rewarded for fighting, and Khorne rewards them with exactly that. Nurgle's followers want acceptance and warmth and community, and Nurgle provides all of these things at the price of rot. Tzeentch's followers want power and change, and the satisfaction of their ambitions, and Tzeentch offers all of these while ensuring they are never quite satisfied. Slaanesh's followers want to feel, to experience, to be taken to the limits of sensation, and Slaanesh provides this until the limits themselves are consumed. Each of these offers something that the follower genuinely wants. The corruption involved is the corruption of want itself, the perversion of desire, into something that cannot be satisfied and cannot be escaped. But at the core of each relationship between a chaos god and their followers is something that functions like reciprocity, like an exchange in which the follower receives something meaningful. Malice offers nothing of the kind. His followers hate serving him. The lore makes this explicit and foundational. They serve that which they hate. This is the defining characteristic of Malilite worship. Not love, not fear in the productive sense, not ambition, not the desperate hoping that chaos service typically involves. Hatred. Active, persistent, genuine contempt for the thing being worshipped. And yet, they serve. Why? The answer that the lore suggests is instrumental. They serve Malice not because of what he gives them directly, but because of what his service enables them to do. Malice's service is a weapon against the other chaos gods. His followers' devotion is the price they pay for access to the specific tools and capabilities required to pursue the thing they actually want, which is the destruction of those other gods and their servants. A follower of Malice might have come from anywhere, might have been a former servant of Khorne who came to hate what Khorne had made of them, might have been a devotee of Nurgle who watched what Nurgle's gifts actually cost and found the cost unbearable, might have been someone who never served any chaos god, but who saw their world consumed by chaos and decided that the only available response to that consumption was to become part of the consuming force and direct it back at itself. In each case, the path to Malice runs through a specific and important kind of disillusionment. Not the disillusionment of someone who expected something good and received something bad. The disillusionment of someone who received exactly what they should have expected and found the receiving of it unacceptable. The doomed ones, Malice's elite warriors, are called that not as honorific, but as honest description. They are doomed. Their service drains them. Their connection to Malice costs something that cannot be recovered. A slow and persistent leaking of vitality that Caleb Dark's pallor in the old comics represented visually a depletion that continues as long as the service continues, and that cannot be compensated for by any gift the god provides. They give more than they receive. That is the arrangement. That is the only arrangement available, and yet they stay. They continue to serve. They continue to fight. They continue to give, knowing that the giving will not be replenished, knowing that the cost will eventually become total, knowing that in the end, there is nothing waiting for them in Malice's service that resembles reward. This is the theology of pure will, of choosing a cause that you know will consume you because the cause matters more than whether you survive it, of committing to a mission with full awareness that the commitment itself is the mechanism of your destruction. It is, in the darkest possible way, heroic. The specific kind of heroism involved is the heroism of the person who sees a situation that cannot be resolved in their favor, and who decides that not favoring them is less important than resolving it. The doomed ones are not going to win, not in any personal or individual sense. They are going to be used up by their god in the service of a project that will, if it ever reaches completion, leave nothing behind that they could inhabit. Their victory, if it comes, is the victory of a system being taken to its conclusion, not the victory of people who fought and survived to enjoy what they fought for. They fight anyway. They fight because the alternative is to let the four great gods continue operating without opposition from within their own structural category, to let chaos proceed toward its inevitable domination without the internal resistance that Malice provides. They fight because someone has to, and because no one else is going to. In a universe built on power and domination, and the crushing inevitability of forces too large for individuals to resist, the doomed ones are the people who decided to oppose the crushing force directly, not through hope of winning, not through faith in eventual rescue, through the cold and clear-eyed commitment to a project that their personal interests should have made them abandon long ago. They are, in this terrible and specific way, the most admirable things in the warp, the most honest things, the most human things, the people who chose purpose over survival, who chose the mission over themselves. And they chose it in service of a god they hate. The laughter of the outcast god fills the tomb of space. And in the cold of that vast emptiness, the warriors who hate serving him continue to serve, because the alternative is the thing they hate even more. There is something in this that resonates beyond fiction, beyond the specific context of a wargame's theology. The feeling of being committed to something because the alternative is worse, even when the commitment is costly, even when it drains rather than replenishes, even when the thing you are committed to is something you would not choose if you had a better option. The feeling of being the doomed one, the person who knows exactly what this costs and pays it anyway. Malice gives that feeling a divine home, a patron who embodies it rather than offering an escape from it. The god of the people who have nowhere else to go, who serve without hope of reward, who fight without hope of victory, who persist, simply because persistence is all that is available, and stopping would mean something worse than continuing. In the grim darkness of the far future, that is not nothing. That might be the most important thing. Extended section. The aesthetic language of Malice. The visual vocabulary of Malice and his followers communicates something that the written lore elaborates on, but does not create. The aesthetic came first, in a sense, because the symbol of the half-white, half-black skull is more immediately expressive than any description of what it represents. Black and white as a color pairing communicates something specific that neither color communicates alone. Black alone suggests negation, darkness, the absence of light, the familiar vocabulary of evil and death in most human cultures. White alone suggests purity, emptiness, the sacred, the divine in its most bleached and reduced form. Neither is particularly interesting in isolation as a representation of a complex theological concept. Together, balanced against each other in equal halves, they communicate something different. They communicate opposition that is internal rather than external, a thing that contains its own counter, that is simultaneously itself and the negation of itself. That cannot be understood without acknowledging that it consists of two things in permanent tension rather than one thing in stable existence. The color scheme is a visual statement about division, about a nature that cannot be resolved into a single form, about something that is perpetually in conflict with itself, while presenting as unified. The skull that serves as Malice's symbol is, in the tradition of Warhammer, immediately recognizable as belonging to the world of death and darkness and chaos. The skull is the standard iconography of mortality, of decay, of the reminder that all things end. In the chaos context specifically, skulls are the currency of Khorne's power, the objects of his worship, the piles that constitute the landscape of his domain. The skull symbol is deeply embedded in the aesthetic grammar of chaos-adjacent imagery. What Malice does with the skull is divide it, split it. Make of the universal death symbol a thing that contains within itself the most fundamental visual statement about opposition, one half white, one half black, the symbol of death divided against itself. The universal end symbol unable to be a unified thing, perpetually occupied by its own internal division. This is what Malice is. This is what his aesthetic says. I am the thing that cannot be unified. I am the death symbol that is in conflict with itself. I am the end that contains within it the end of the end. The sons of Malice wearing this heraldry on their power armor are wearing a theological statement as clearly as any other Chaos Space Marines wear their allegiances. But where the World Eater's red communicates rage, and the Death Guard's green communicates decay, and the Thousand Sons blue and gold communicates sorcerous tradition, the Sun's black and white communicates something more abstract and more unsettling. Division, internal opposition, the specific quality of being simultaneously two things that negate each other. Warriors who look like that, who have committed to that specific visual vocabulary, are communicating that they are not merely servants of darkness. They are servants of darkness that is simultaneously light, of a thing that cannot be placed on any simple spectrum, from good to evil or from order to chaos. Something that occupies a position that the standard frameworks cannot account for. The silence, as visual performance and as practical reality, extends the aesthetic into behavior. A color scheme that says, I am divided against myself, is consistent with a behavioral presentation that says, I refuse to provide the emotional commentary that would make me legible to you. Both communicate the same thing. I am not what you expect. I am not organized around the principles you use to understand things. I am something your frameworks were not built to handle. The number 11, appearing in every structural element of the chapter's organization and ritual, extends the aesthetic into mathematics. Sacred numbers in Warhammer are not arbitrary. Khorne's 8 reflects the 8-pointed Chaos Star, with its points oriented toward pure violence. Nurgle's 7 reflects the cycles of disease and decay. Tzeentch's 9 reflects the multiplicity of his schemes and the recursive nature of his plans. Slaaneish's 6 reflects pleasure taken to its hexagonal extreme. 11 sits outside this structure. The other sacred numbers belong to a system of divine mathematics in which the 4 great gods occupy positions that can be mapped and related to each other. 11 does not fit that system. It is prime in a way that the other numbers are not, irreducible, unable to be generated from the factors of the other sacred numbers. It arrives after the counting of the standard system is done, and insists that the counting was not finished. It is the number that says, there is something more than what you have accounted for, and that something is me. In every aspect of its presentation, Malice is communicating the same thing. He is the element of the system that the system cannot contain, the force that the structure generates but cannot accommodate. The thing that grows because of what everything else does rather than despite it, that becomes more powerful as the power it opposes grows, that represents the universe's tendency toward entropy, not as an enemy of the universe, but as its most honest expression. He is what happens when you take chaos seriously, when you follow its logic all the way to the end, when you do not stop at corruption is power or destruction is worship, but continue through to destruction is self-consuming, and chaos ultimately destroys itself along with everything else. He is chaos being honest with itself, and chaos hates him for it. Extended section. The Sons of Malice in Battle Tactics and Terror. Understanding the Sons of Malice as a military force requires understanding that their approach to warfare is as theologically motivated as every other aspect of their existence. They do not fight the way other Chaos Space Marines fight. They do not fight the way loyalist Space Marines fight. They fight the way something fights when it has abandoned every consideration except the efficient completion of a mission, it will not stop pursuing, regardless of cost. Begin with their tactical approach to engagement. Most military forces, even the most aggressive and the most dedicated among the Imperium's many varieties of soldier, operate with some awareness of resource conservation. Ammunition is finite. Warriors can be injured. Strategic positions have value that exceeds any individual engagement. Even Space Marine chapters, whose individual warriors are enormously expensive to produce and whose numbers are therefore always limited, operate with some attention to the sustainability of their operations over the long term. The Sons of Malice fight as though sustainability is irrelevant. This is not recklessness. Recklessness implies that the reckless party is not thinking about the consequences of their actions. The Sons think about consequences. They simply have a different relationship with those consequences than most forces do. Their theology tells them they are already doomed. Their service to malice drains them, regardless of what they do on any given battlefield. The cost of fighting is built into the cost of existing. Fighting aggressively does not add significantly to a bill that is already being paid continuously. What this produces in practice is a willingness to sustain and accept losses that would cause most commanders to reassess their approach, that the Sons of Malice simply absorb and continue operating through. Not because they do not feel losses, not because the death of a brother is meaningless to them, but because the mission continues regardless of what the losses are. The mission always continues. The war against everyone, against the Imperium, against the other chaos gods, against the universe that produced both and discarded them. That war does not have an acceptable defeat condition. It cannot be called off. It can only be paused while conditions for resumption are prepared. Their silence in battle is both tactical and ideological, as we have discussed, but it produces specific operational advantages that deserve attention. Communication in battle through sound is a significant vulnerability. Enemies who can hear command signals, who can intercept Vox communications, who can track the movements of forces by the sounds they make, have significant intelligence advantages. The Sons of Malice deny these advantages completely. They do not issue audible commands. Their movements are coordinated through methods that the lore does not fully explain, but that produce results as effectively as any more vocal command structure. The effect on enemy psychology is documented and significant. Facing an opponent who produces no sound is disorienting in ways that combat training does not typically prepare soldiers for. The human brain, even the enhanced brain of a space marine who has been conditioned against most forms of psychological disruption, has deep and persistent responses to silence in contexts where sound would be expected. The absence of expected sounds is processed as threat information. The brain generates anxiety responses to fill the gap. The Sons of Malice, simply by maintaining their silence, are constantly engaging the threat response systems of everyone they face, without doing anything that can be tactically countered. Their use of the number 11 in battlefield organization reflects their theological priorities. Squads of 11 rather than 10, units structured to produce totals that resolve to 11 or multiples of 11. The sacred mathematics built into every level of military organization. This is not tactically optimal in the standard Codex Astartes sense. An 11th member of a standard squad does not provide enough additional firepower or capability to justify the logistical complications of the non-standard unit size. But tactical optimization is not the only value. The warfare of the Sons of Malice is also always a ritual performance, always an act of worship, always a demonstration to their god and to themselves of what they are. Their targeting priorities reflect their dual hatreds. They will engage Imperial forces with full commitment when they encounter them. They will engage Chaos forces with equal or sometimes greater commitment. There is evidence in the lore that they reserve a specific intensity for followers of the four great Chaos gods that reflects not simply the tactical logic of eliminating Chaos threats, but the theological logic of their service to Malice. Killing Khornate warriors is worship. Killing Nurgle's plague marines is worship. Every enemy they eliminate who served one of the four great gods is an offering to the renegade god, a small contribution to the project of reducing the power of his enemies. The trophies they collect from slain Chaos champions are not simply evidence of victories. They are relics, sacred objects that represent the completion of specific acts of worship. The helmet of a World Eater's champion, mounted on the prow of a Sons of Malice vehicle, is a statement that someone powerful in Khorne's service is no longer serving Khorne's interests. The helmet of a Plague champion, similarly displayed, represents a reduction in Nurgle's capacity to spread his gifts. These trophies are a running account of devotion paid, visible to Malice himself if he pays attention to such things, and the Sons presumably believe he does. Their engagement at the 13th Black Crusade is documented in the novel Cadia Stands, and offers insight into how the chapter balances their multiple hatreds in practice. When Abaddon's forces pushed out of the Eye of Terror, the Sons of Malice were positioned to fight alongside, adjacent to, and against both the Chaos forces and the Imperium simultaneously, taking advantage of the chaos of the Great Conflict to pursue their own agenda within it. They attacked the Cadian refugees, not as part of Abaddon's plan or in service of any broader chaos agenda. They attacked because their agenda required it, because the opportunity presented itself, and because they had been waiting for it. The scene where the Sons of Malice intercept a fleet of fleeing Cadians, attacking vessels carrying wounded soldiers and civilians, and the remnants of a civilization that had been shattered by the fall of their world's Cadian gate, is one of the bleaker moments in Warhammer 40,000 fiction, and it is bleak specifically because of the cold and structural nature of the hatred driving it. There is no hot fury in the Sons of Malice attack, no passion, just the cold, settled determination of people who decided 1,000 years ago what they were going to do when the opportunity arrived, and are now doing it. The Cadian 331st killed their people. The 331st is gone now. Cadia itself is gone. The people who inherited the 331st's designation, the soldiers who carry that regimental number in the aftermath of the planet's destruction, are not the people who committed the genocide on Celis. They are not even the descendants of those people in any direct biological sense, not after 1,000 years, but they carry the name. They carry the institutional identity that carries the act. And for the Sons of Malice, that is enough. There is something almost philosophical about the precision of this grievance. The Sons are not simply angry. They have developed, over 1,000 years, a fully articulated theory of collective responsibility, in which institutional identity transmits moral accountability across generations. The Cadian regiments that exist in 999, M41, are the Cadian regiments that killed the Sons people in approximately 000, M41, not in the individual sense, but in the institutional sense. The institution persists. The act is the institution's act. The accountability persists as long as the institution does. This is an extraordinarily sophisticated moral framework for a chapter of Chaos Space Marines to be operating under. Most Chaos forces do not develop ethical theories. They act on impulse, or on the direct orders of their patron gods, or on the simple calculus of violence. The Sons of Malice have spent a millennium building a complete and internally consistent moral philosophy to justify what they do, and that philosophy, however dark its applications, is genuinely sophisticated. They are, in the most uncomfortable way, principled. Extended section: Malice and the broader question of warp gods. The existence of Malice raises broader questions about the warp and the nature of divine beings within it that the Four Gods-only framework tends to suppress. If the warp is fundamentally generated by and responsive to conscious emotional experience, and if that experience is as varied and as morally complex as conscious experience actually is, why do we not see more divine beings? Why are the four great gods the dominant representation? The partial answer is power. The four great gods have been accumulating psychic mass for longer and have drawn on broader emotional frequencies than most entities that have attempted to crystallize in the warp. They have reach, they have momentum, they are established, in the way that established powers are always able to maintain themselves against upstart challenges simply through the advantage of existing infrastructure and accumulated strength. But there are also minor gods. The lore acknowledges them. Strange entities that represent narrower emotional frequencies, that have smaller followings and more limited domains, and less capacity to manifest at the scale the great gods can. Most of them are never named because naming them would imply a level of canonical importance they do not actually have. Malice is different from these minor gods, in a specific and important way. He does not represent a narrow emotional frequency. He does not embody one small aspect of human experience. He embodies something as broad and as universal as what the great gods embody, perhaps more universal than any of them individually. The tendency of complex systems towards self-defeating behavior. The reality that destructive forces, taken to their extremes, destroy themselves along with their targets. The specific emotional experience of hating the thing you are part of. Every civilization that has ever existed has produced people who felt this way about their civilization. Every religion has produced people who despised the religion while remaining unable to leave it. Every ideology has produced people who saw exactly what was wrong with the ideology and could not escape it. Every army has produced soldiers who hated the army and stayed anyway. Every family has produced members who could not stand the family and could not stop belonging to it. The feeling of being trapped in something you hate, of serving something you despise because the alternative is worse, of being the internal critic who cannot resign. This is not a narrow or unusual human experience. It is, if anything, one of the most universal. This means that malice is being fed by an enormous number of sources that the lore around him tends not to emphasize. He is fed by every person who hates the institution they work for and cannot leave. He is fed by every citizen who despises the government they live under and cannot imagine surviving outside it. He is fed by every soldier who hates the war they are fighting and cannot stop fighting it. He is fed by every follower of any cause who sees clearly what is wrong with the cause and follows it anyway. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is full of these people. The Imperium produces them by the billion. An authoritarian structure that claims to serve humanity while treating individual humans as expendable units of production generates tremendous quantities of the specific kind of resentment that malice feeds on. The followers of the four great chaos gods generate it as well, as the reality of what they signed up for becomes clear and the cost becomes undeniable. In this light, Malice's power level relative to the four great gods might be considerably higher than his limited canonical presence suggests. He is not drawing from a narrow well. He is drawing from the psychic byproduct of every person in the universe who serves something they hate and cannot stop serving. That is not a small group. The lore's focus on Malice as a minor chaos god may reflect the canonical reality that his power is parasitic and therefore structurally difficult to measure, that he does not have the same kind of measurable, addressable presence that the four great gods have. That his nature as the thing that grows in the spaces between the other things makes him hard to quantify in the terms the warp uses to measure divine power. Not because he is actually weak, because he is a different kind of power, operating in a different mode. The four great gods are enormous, concentrated forces. They have domains, territories, established positions in the psychic topology of the warp. They can be located, in principle, if you have the ability to navigate the immaterium and the willingness to approach them. Malice is distributed. He is present in the spaces, in the gaps, in the overflow. He is everywhere that the other gods are not quite, which is to say, he is everywhere. The chambers of space, the tomb of space, these are not small places. They are the overwhelming majority of the universe. The domains of the four great gods, vast as they are, occupy a fraction of the total volume of the warp. Everything else is the space where Malice lives. That is not nothing. That might, if the theology is taken seriously, be considerably more than nothing. Extended section. The future of Malice. What could still be told? We have explored what has been told. What remains is the question of what could yet be told. What the concept of malice makes possible that has not yet been written. What the setting would look like if Games Workshop were to fully commit to the renegade god as a canonical presence rather than a carefully managed half-presence. The most obvious possibility is a fully realized Sons of Malice supplement. Not a brief Index Astartes article, but a complete faction treatment with full historical detail, a proper army list, painting guides, and a campaign narrative that allows players to engage with the chapter as a genuine three-way faction alongside loyalists and the four gods' chaos forces. This would be creatively extraordinary. The Sons of Malice, as a playable army whose tactical goals include fighting both other chaos forces and imperial forces, who score points by eliminating both categories of enemy, who represent on the tabletop the theological reality of their existence as universal enemies. This would be unlike anything currently available in the hobby. The challenge is that fully developing the Sons of Malice requires fully developing Malice, and fully developing Malice runs into the legal complications we have discussed throughout this video. The most ambitious version of this would involve resolving those complications, reaching some arrangement with the original creators that allows the renegade god's full name and concept to be incorporated without legal risk. Games Workshop in 2026 is not the same company that was unable or unwilling to reach that arrangement in the late 1980s. They are a global enterprise with substantial legal resources and a commercial track record that makes most intellectual property arrangements worth pursuing when the concept is valuable enough. The question of whether Malal and Caleb Dark are worth the cost of whatever arrangement would be required to fully reclaim them is ultimately a commercial one, and it is not obviously answered in the negative. If Malice were to be fully developed, the narrative possibilities are significant. The implication of the labyrinth, that the Sons have now successfully summoned their god into physical reality and are preparing to retake their home world of Skelos, has been hanging in the air since 2010 without resolution. Following through on that implication would require exploring what happens when a chaos god walks in the material universe, what effects that has on the local fabric of reality, how the Imperium and the other chaos forces respond to an entity whose agenda is opposed to everyone. The connection to the missing Primarchs, if Games Workshop were to decide to develop it, represents one of the most significant possible narrative developments in the entire history of the setting. Confirming that the 11th Legion's fate involved Malice would resolve one of Warhammer's oldest mysteries, while simultaneously expanding the Malice lore enormously, providing it with a history that stretches back to the founding of the Imperium itself and connects it to the Horus Heresy in direct and significant ways. There is also the question of what Malice's full manifestation in the material universe would mean for the other Chaos gods. The lore is clear that they fear him. A manifestation at scale, not the limited summoning described in the Labyrinth, but something more substantial, something that begins to make the kind of impact on the material universe that the four great gods make from their warp-based positions, would force a response from the ruinous powers that would be genuinely new in the setting. Not another intra-chaos conflict of the great game variety, but a genuine confrontation between the established order of the warp and the thing that has always existed to undo that order. The creative potential is enormous. The legal and commercial obstacles are real. Whether they will be overcome is unknown, but the concept is there. The seed was planted in 1985 by two writers who probably did not imagine it would still be germinating 40 years later, in a setting that has grown around it and sometimes over it, but has never quite buried it entirely. The renegade god persists. In the margins and the footnotes, in the index entries and the occasional short story, in the color scheme that appears in painting guides, and the sacred number that appears in chapter organization, and the half-whispered name that appears in the darkest corners of the warp's lore. He persists because the concept he represents is real. Because the thing he embodies is genuinely present in conscious experience, in the specific and persistent feeling of serving something you hate because you cannot escape it, in the knowledge that the forces you oppose are generating the conditions of their own destruction, and you are the thing that grows in those conditions. He persists because the laughter of the outcast god, once you have heard it, fills more than the tomb of space. It fills every quiet moment where you think about what you are part of, and whether what you are part of is worth what it costs. That question does not go away just because the legal status of the character who embodies it is complicated. The question was there before Malal was created. It will be there long after the last publication that mentions him fades from memory. He was not invented. He was found, discovered in the specific shape that the universe was already making, given a name and a symbol and a champion and a story. And he is still here, in the space between the things that have been named, in the overflow of the things that have been empowered, in the cold and the dark and the silence, laughing. Extended section. Malice across the timeline from the Great Crusade to the present. One of the richest and most underdeveloped aspects of Malice lore is the question of his timeline, when he emerged as a significant presence in the warp relative to the other great events of Warhammer 40,000 history, and what his existence might have looked like at different points in that history. The four great chaos gods have timelines that are at least partially documented. Khorne is ancient, born early in the galaxy's history from the first accumulated violence of sentient beings. Nurgle emerged more gradually, building on the psychic weight of disease and despair across long spans of biological evolution. Tzeentch crystallized from the accumulated ambitions of developing civilizations. Slaanesh was born in a specific documented catastrophe with a date that can be approximately mapped to the setting's timeline. Malice's emergence is less clearly placed. The lore describes him as having been cast out from the other gods at some unspecified point in the past, suggests that he was in some sense part of the structure before he was expelled from it, but does not give us anything like a precise moment of emergence or expulsion. He is simply present in the lore as something that has always been there, a constant that the setting assumes without establishing its origin. This ambiguity is appropriate for his nature, but frustrating for anyone trying to understand how he relates to the broader history. Let us think through what can be inferred. If Malice is, as his nature suggests, the embodiment of the warp's self-destructive tendency, the force that grows from the overflow of the other gods' activities, then he cannot predate those gods in any meaningful sense. You cannot have a parasite without a host. You cannot have the self-destructive force of chaos without chaos already being present. His emergence, or at least his growth to the level of meaningful divine presence, must have followed the emergence of at least some of the four great gods. This suggests that the passage from the Great Book of Despair, which describes him as "he that went before, who now came last," refers not to chronological sequence, but to positional priority within the chaos structure at different times. He was once, perhaps, more central to the chaos structure than he eventually became, and his expulsion reduced his position from priority to last. What was his role before the expulsion? The lore gives us almost nothing here. The phrase, "grown mightily indignant at the words of the gods," implies a relationship that was once collaborative, or at least non-hostile. You can only be indignant at the words of beings you considered at least equal. Contempt is the response to words from beings you considered beneath you. Hurt is the response to words from beings you loved. Indignation is the specific response to being told something by beings you considered peers that you found unacceptable. It implies a prior relationship of rough parity. Was there a time when Malice was a recognized member of the Chaos Pantheon? When the self-destructive force of chaos was not something that the other gods expelled, but something they incorporated? The theology of chaos does acknowledge that chaos contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction, that the great game is not merely a competition, but a mutual consumption. Perhaps Malice was once the acknowledged expression of that tendency, the face the chaos gods put on their own self-defeating nature when they wanted to recognize it. And perhaps what happened, whatever was said, whatever provoked the indignation and the flight, was that the other gods decided they no longer wanted to acknowledge that face, that having it around was inconvenient, that the tendency it represented was something they preferred to operate as an unacknowledged background process rather than as a recognized divine peer. If so, the expulsion was not about power. It was about acknowledgement. The other gods cast Malice out, not because they could not tolerate his power, but because they could not tolerate what his existence said about them. He is the mirror that showed them what they were heading toward, and rather than look at that reflection, they removed the mirror, which makes his persistence all the more pointed. You cannot uninvent a reflection. You cannot expel the truth about what you are from a universe that generates you from that truth. Every time the four great gods act, every time they pursue their natures and build their power, they are writing the truth that Malice represents into the fabric of the warp. He grows. He strengthens. He becomes more present and more undeniable with every victory they win. In the setting's current moment, in the 41st millennium, with the Great Rift tearing the galaxy in half, and the four great gods more powerful than they have been in millennia, and chaos corruption spreading into spaces previously resistant to it, the implication is that Malice is also more powerful than he has been in millennia. Every triumph of the chaos gods, every world that falls, every soul that is claimed, every champion who ascends to daemonhood, adds to the overflow that feeds him. The fall of Cadia was one of the most significant victories for chaos in 10,000 years. The Great Rift itself represents an unprecedented expansion of chaotic influence into the material universe, a wound that may never heal, a permanent change in the relationship between the warp and real space that makes everything chaos does easier. All of this empowers the four great gods enormously. All of this, therefore, empowers malice enormously. If the sons of malice managed to summon a manifestation of their god in approximately 999 M41, before the fall of Cadia, before the Great Rift, at a moment when chaos was powerful, but not yet at the current level of dominance, then whatever they might be able to summon now, after a decade of unprecedented chaos power, after the Great Rift and all its consequences, must be significantly more substantial. The story that has not yet been told is the story of what the renegade god looks like when he is well fed, when the overflow he subsists on is flowing in unprecedented volumes. When the four great gods' victories have been so complete and so sustained that his parasitic share of that power has grown into something that might, for the first time, be able to contest those gods more directly than a scattered collection of renegade space marines and a single limited manifestation. That story has not been told. It may never be told, given the legal complications and the commercial considerations involved. But the potential is there, written into the structure of the lore by the nature of what malice is. He has been waiting for exactly this moment for 10,000 years. Extended section. Comparing the renegade gods across settings. For completeness, and because it enriches the picture of what malice represents within the broader Warhammer mythology, it is worth spending time comparing how the concept of a renegade or self-destructive chaos deity has been expressed across different parts of the Warhammer universe. In Warhammer Fantasy, Malal's absence was filled most directly by Zuvasan and Nekaho, as we have discussed. But in Age of Sigmar, Games Workshop's current iteration of the fantasy setting, the replacement of the world of Warhammer Fantasy with a new cosmological structure created space for new approaches to this same question. The Great Horned Rat, who in Warhammer Fantasy was the patron deity of the Skaven, a position that was already unusual in that it represented a non-human species having their own Chaos God equivalent, was elevated in Age of Sigmar to full membership in the Chaos Pantheon alongside the Four. This makes Age of Sigmar a setting with 5 acknowledged Chaos Gods rather than 4, which is interesting not because it directly addresses the malice question, but because it demonstrates that Games Workshop is willing to expand the Chaos Pantheon when the narrative and commercial logic supports it. The Great Horned Rat's elevation is also interesting because of the way it happened. Slaanesh, in Age of Sigmar lore, is captured by the Ealdari gods and removed from direct play in the new setting's early narrative. The Great Horned Rat essentially takes Slaanesh's seat at the table of divine power, filling the gap created by that absence. This is not a precise parallel to Malice's situation, but it demonstrates a pattern in how Games Workshop handles divine power vacuums and adjustments to their pantheon. If Slaanesh were to be permanently resolved in some future Age of Sigmar narrative, what fills that void would be an interesting question. The Great Horned Rat's position would presumably be secure, being now an established member of the pantheon. But the underlying emotional domain that Slaanesh represents, sensation and excess, and the pursuit of experience taken to its extreme, would presumably still generate a divine presence of some kind, because the emotional current that generates gods does not stop when the god it previously sustained is removed. In Warhammer 40,000 specifically, the question of what fills power vacuums in the Chaos Pantheon is relevant because the setting has its own history of godlike entities emerging from unexpected sources. The Teo Fourth Sphere of Expansion narrative introduces a being of some kind that manifested in the warp from the Teo's collective psychic expression of the greater good, their species' fundamental philosophical commitment. This being, while never clearly defined or given a name in the canonical sense, is described in terms that suggest a nascent, divine entity of the warp, something that has crystallized from the Tao's collective feeling in the same way that the great gods crystallized from species-wide emotional currents. This is significant because it confirms that the warp is still actively generating new divine entities in the settings present, that the 4 great gods have not monopolized the available psychic space in any permanent or total way, that new gods are possible and are happening. Against this backdrop, Malice's position is more interesting than it might otherwise seem. He is not a relic, a concept from an earlier, less developed version of the setting that does not fit the current cosmology. He is an entity whose mechanism of existence, parasitic growth from the four great gods' activities, is entirely consistent with how the warp is currently understood to work. He is an entity whose power level should be increasing as the setting's story produces more and more chaos victories. He is an entity whose most recent documented appearance suggested an increase in capacity, a manifestation in physical reality that represented something new in his history. He is not a historical footnote. He is a living concept in a living setting, present in the gaps and growing in them, waiting for the moment when the conditions are right for something more. Extended section: The Literary Roots of Malice, Michael Moorcock and the Eternal Champion. No exploration of Malice's conceptual origins would be complete without acknowledging the enormous debt that the early Warhammer universe owes to Michael Moorcock, specifically to the Eternal Champion cycle and to the specific philosophical framework that Moorcock built into those books. Moorcock's Eternal Champion is a concept that appears in slightly different forms across dozens of novels and stories, but whose essential shape is always the same. An individual, always male in the early stories, though the concept evolved, who is the incarnation of a cosmic principle, who exists to serve the balance between the forces of law and chaos, who takes different forms and different names across different worlds and different times, but who is always fundamentally the same, being serving the same cosmic function. The most famous of these incarnations is Elric of Melniboné, the albino sorcerer emperor whose soul is bound to a black rune sword called Stormbringer. Stormbringer is a living weapon that drinks souls, that compels its wielder toward violence, that hungers for the spiritual essence of those it kills and cannot be denied. The sword kills Elric's closest friends. It kills his lover. It kills his kinsman. And Elric, bound to it by a dependency that cannot be broken, continues to carry it because the alternative is a form of impotence that the demands of his cosmic role will not permit. The resonance with Caleb Dark and the Dreadaxe is not accidental. The parallels are too close to be independent invention. A pale and depleted champion, a soul-drinking weapon, a relationship with that weapon that is both enabling and consuming. A mission that requires doing terrible things in service of a goal that is ostensibly opposed to what the terrible things represent. The Moorcock influence on early Warhammer is widely acknowledged. Rick Priestley and others who worked on the game during its founding era were open about the extent to which the Chaos framework drew on Moorcock's cosmic dualism, his concept of the eternal war between law and chaos, his notion of a multiverse in which the same archetypal conflict is played out in different registers across different worlds. But where Moorcock's framework includes a genuine balance, a cosmic principle that requires both law and chaos to exist, and that the Eternal Champion serves by preventing either from achieving total dominance, the Warhammer setting radically simplified this into a good versus evil framework, with law becoming order and order being primarily represented by the Imperium and chaos being the enemy. The nuance of Moorcock's model, in which both law and chaos are extremes to be avoided and only the balance between them is truly desirable, was largely lost in this simplification. Malal, as created by Wagner and Grant, arguably represents an attempt to recover something of Moorcock's nuance within the Warhammer framework. If the four great gods represent chaos, taken to its extreme in four specific directions, Malal represents the principle that chaos taken to any extreme is self-defeating, that the things chaos does are ultimately self-consuming, that the universe has a corrective mechanism built into its most chaotic processes. This is closer to Moorcock's actual cosmic framework than the simplified good versus evil model that the main Warhammer setting usually operates on. Malal is not exactly chaos's answer to order. He is chaos's own internal answer to itself, the thing that prevents any of the four great gods from ever achieving the total dominance they seek, because their seeking of dominance feeds the thing that will undo their dominance. In Moorcock's terms, Malal is the balance mechanism in the chaos side of the equation. Not external constraint imposed by law, but internal constraint generated by chaos itself, the universe's own tendency to resist extremity in any direction. This makes him, philosophically, the most interesting entity in the setting. The four great gods are all extreme expressions of single principles, Malal is the meta-principle that makes extreme expression self-defeating. He is not about any specific feeling or domain or mode of being. He is about what happens when any feeling or domain or mode of being is pursued without limit. Wagner and Grant, coming from the tradition of British comics writing that was itself deeply influenced by Moorcock, brought this philosophical depth into a setting that was, at the time, still finding its own philosophical grounding. The result was a character that was more conceptually sophisticated than the setting could fully contain at that stage of its development. And when the legal situation made it impossible to continue using that character, the philosophical depth he had represented went largely underground, present in fragments and implications, but no longer explicitly voiced. The return of Malice, even in its carefully managed and legally safe form, represents the setting's attempt to recover that depth without fully acknowledging its origin. It works, to the extent that it works, because the concept itself is sound. Because a universe that is built on the generation of chaos from conscious feeling inevitably also generates the self-destructive tendency of chaos as part of the same process. Because a mythology of four great gods benefits structurally from having a fifth that embodies their common limitation. The seed Moorcock planted in the Warhammer setting through his influence on its creators, and that Wagner and Grant named and gave a face in 1985, has not died. It has been managed and constrained and carefully kept from growing too large, but it has not died. And in its managed and constrained and legally safe form, it continues to be one of the most interesting concepts the setting contains. Extended section: the community's relationship with Malice, why fans never let go. The Warhammer community's relationship with Malice is one of the most interesting fan phenomena in the entire hobby. Most obscure lore concepts fade from attention when they are not actively developed by the official content pipeline. The community's engagement with them diminishes as the absence of new material reduces the opportunities for discussion. Players move on, new shiny things arrive, and capture the available attention. Malice has not followed this pattern. For 40 years, since those first Citadel Compendium issues with the Caleb Dark comic strips, the community has maintained an active and persistent interest in the concept that no amount of official non-acknowledgement has been able to extinguish. Every forum generation rediscovers him. Every new group of players gets introduced to the concept by someone who encountered it in their own research and felt the same electric recognition that the concept always seems to generate when people encounter it fresh. What is it about Malice specifically that produces this persistent engagement? Part of it is the appeal of forbidden knowledge. The lore community is deeply drawn to things that Games Workshop seems reluctant to discuss, things that exist in the spaces between official acknowledgements, things that reward deep research and careful reading rather than casual engagement. Malice is one of the ultimate examples of this category. He exists in the setting, but cannot be directly named in current publications. He has canonical presence, but the nature of that presence requires interpretation. Engaging seriously with his lore involves engaging with the real-world history of why the lore is the way it is, with the legal and commercial story that shaped what was and was not possible to include in the official material. This intersection of fictional lore and real-world history is genuinely unusual in hobby contexts. Usually, the fictional universe is simply fiction, created by professionals and consumed by fans, with the relationship between the two remaining fairly clear. The Malice situation blurs this, because the fictional story of a god being expelled from the structure he was part of mirrors so precisely the real-world story of a creative concept being expelled from the fictional universe it was part of. The lore and the meta-lore become one story, and that combined story is stranger and richer than either would be alone. Part of the persistent appeal is also the community's sense that Games Workshop is leaving something valuable, undeveloped. The renegade god concept is genuinely interesting in a way that players can articulate clearly when asked. It adds something to the setting that nothing else adds. The possibility of a faction that is opposed to both sides of the central conflict, that represents a different kind of nihilism than any of the four great gods, that fights everyone because fighting everyone is what its theology demands. Players can see clearly what this would add to the hobby if it were fully developed. You can imagine the campaigns and the narratives and the army lists and the faction dynamics that a fully realized Sons of Malice faction would enable. The persistent community engagement is in part the persistent expression of that unfulfilled potential. Every fan discussion of Malice is also, in some sense, a plea for Games Workshop to finish what was started in 1985. And part of it is simply that the concept resonates emotionally in ways that other Chaos factions do not. The specific emotional register of serving something you hate, of being committed to a cause that is consuming you, of fighting on in the knowledge that you are doomed and fighting anyway. This resonates with a particular kind of person in a way that Khorne's rage, or Nurgle's acceptance, or Tzientch's scheming, or Slaaneish's indulgence do not. The Doomed Ones have fans who are Doomed Ones fans specifically because they recognize something in that description, because there is a version of their own lives that maps onto it in some metaphorical way, because they have felt at some point the specific combination of contempt for what they are serving and the inability to stop serving it, and finding that feeling given cosmic scale and theological dignity in a fictional universe is, in some strange way, useful. This is what good speculative fiction does. It takes human experiences and gives them shapes that are larger than the experiences themselves, that make the experiences visible and discussable and worthy of consideration in a way that they might not be if they simply remained as the small and personal things they are in daily life. Malice, as a concept, gives the experience of being trapped in service to something you despise, a mythological home, a patron deity. A validation that this feeling is real, is meaningful, is something the universe itself generates and gives form to. The community does not forget him, because what he represents is unforgettable. It is written into the emotional architecture of too many people who engage seriously with this hobby. The renegade god was created in 1985, and the legal situation took him away. But the feeling he was created from was never going away. He was found, not invented. And the finding keeps happening every time someone new encounters the concept and feels that electric recognition. The laughter of the outcast god fills the tomb of space. And the community that keeps finding him keeps recognizing that laughter is something they have heard before, in their own quiet moments. In the dark, when the things they are committed to are most clearly visible for what they cost, he is always here. He has always been here. He grows in the spaces between the light, and he is laughing. The final meditation, what the renegade god teaches us about. Warhammer 40,000. There is a reason that Warhammer 40,000 resonates so deeply with so many people, and it is not simply the spectacle of giant armored warriors and ancient alien civilizations and weapons that can level continents. The spectacle is part of it, but spectacle alone does not sustain engagement across decades. What sustains it is the philosophy underneath the spectacle, the accumulated weight of ideas that the setting uses its enormous scale to explore. The central philosophical claim of Warhammer 40,000 is bleak but honest. There are no clean hands in the universe, it describes. Every faction that exists to protect something good does so through means that are themselves terrible. The Imperium of Man preserves humanity at the cost of being the kind of institution that humanity might reasonably need to be preserved from. The Aeldari maintain their cultural survival through assassination and manipulation and the sacrifice of other species' futures. Even the Tau, presented as the setting's most genuinely progressive faction, are building an empire and doing imperial things while doing it. The setting does not offer a side you can root for without reservation. It offers sides you can root for, with reservations you cannot fully suppress. Every fan of the setting eventually makes some kind of peace with this, or refuses to, and either way, the refusal or the acceptance is itself philosophically meaningful. Into this context, Malice arrives with a concept that makes the philosophical stakes even sharper. If the Chaos Gods are in some sense the accumulated emotional weight of sentient experience, if Khorne grew from every act of anger, and Nurgle from every experience of disease and despair, if Tzeentch crystallized from ambition, and Slaanesh from the pursuit of sensation, then there is a disturbing implication that the setting does not always voice directly. These gods are not external to the people who fight them. They are made of those people. They are the psychic residue of what those people have felt and done and hoped and suffered. Fighting chaos is, in some sense, fighting yourself, fighting the parts of your own experience that accumulate in the warp and take on divine form. Every time a soldier hates their enemy, and that hate flows into the warp and makes Khorne fractionally more powerful, the soldier is, without meaning to or knowing it, worshipping the thing they are fighting. Every time a survivor despairs, and that despair flows into the warp and nourishes Nurgle, the survivor is feeding the cosmic force of their own suffering. There is no exit from this in the 41st millennium. No way to fight without feeling, no way to feel without contributing. Existence in the setting is inherently participatory in the chaos process. Every sentient being is always already a donor to the divine entities that want to claim them. Malice takes this disturbing implication and extends it one step further. If the great gods are fed by emotional excess, if they grow powerful on the overflow of experience, then the things they build with that power are also generating overflow. The victories of chaos create conditions that feed something that wants to undo those victories. The more powerful the four great gods become, the more they nourish the force of their own eventual undoing. There is no exit from this for the chaos gods either. The same process that makes them what they are also makes Malice what he is. He is not an enemy they can defeat. He is a consequence they cannot avoid. He is what they become when their nature is fully expressed, the shadow that follows inevitably from the light they project, the debt accumulated by every act of power they perform. This is the most genuinely bleak thought the setting contains, and it generates it not from the grim darkness of war or the cruelty of institutions, but from the basic structure of what it says the universe is and how it works. There is no final victory. Not for the Imperium, not for the Chaos Gods, not for any faction operating within the setting's cosmological rules. There is only the ongoing process of generating power and experiencing the consequences of that power, and those consequences generating new power that generates new consequences, on and on, until heat death or the collapse of all narrative possibility. Malice is the setting's acknowledgement of this. He is the face of the universe's refusal to allow any force to win absolutely. He is not the villain of the story. He is the story's answer to every villain who thinks they are going to win. The renegade god laughs because he knows something everyone else refuses to accept. That the destination all the roads lead to is not victory. It is him. And maybe that is why, in a setting full of grim darkness, he is the most genuinely frightening thing in it. Not because he is cruel, not because he is powerful, but because he is right. Closing. The god that Warhammer 40,000 cannot shake. So here we are. We started this video with a promise. There is a fifth chaos god, and almost nobody knows about him. And if you have stayed with me through everything we have covered, you know now that this is only partly true. The real story is stranger than that framing suggests. There is a concept, a genuinely brilliant and philosophically rich concept, that was born in 1985 in the pages of a Games Workshop hobby magazine, given form by two writers who were creating something new in a setting that was still finding itself. That concept was named Malal, and it was given a champion named Caleb Dark, and it told a story about a chaos god who despised chaos, about a divine force whose entire existence was oriented toward consuming the things that had expelled it. And then the writers left Games Workshop and took their intellectual property with them, and the concept entered a legal no man's land that it has never fully escaped. What replaced it, Malice, is real. Canonical, documented in sourcebooks and novels. The sons of Malice exist and fight, and carry their black and white armor into battles against both the Imperium and the servants of the four great gods. The philosophical structure of the original concept survived the legal disruption. The renegade god is present in the setting, even if his original name is not. But the full development that the concept deserves has never happened. The legal situation created a hesitancy that has persisted for 4 decades, a reluctance to commit too fully to a concept whose origins remain complicated. And so Malice exists in the half-light, present enough to be real, underdeveloped enough to always feel like unfinished business. What I hope this video has given you is an appreciation of what that unfinished business actually involves. Not just a legal dispute about who owns a minor chaos god, but a genuinely significant philosophical concept that adds something to the Warhammer universe that nothing else in that universe provides. The self-defeating force of chaos, the god who grows on the waste product of the other god's power, the fifth presence in the pantheon whose existence is implied by the nature of the other four. He was never just a character. He was an idea. And the ideas, unlike the characters, are not ownable. They persist regardless of what the legal situation does to the name and the face and the champion. Malice is the idea that power consumes itself, that the things you build with chaos tend to become the seeds of that chaos's undoing, that there is no such thing as absolute victory in a universe built the way this one is, that the laughter you hear in the cold and the dark and the silence, in the chambers of space and the tombs of space, is not the laughter of the things that are winning. It is the laughter of the thing that wins when winning is over. The outcast god is out there, in the spaces between the stars, in the overflow of the things that call themselves his enemies, in the black and white worn by warriors who chose to serve him, knowing exactly what that service costs. He is growing. He has always been growing. And somewhere in the fortress monastery of the Sons of Malice, in the sacred chambers where the doomed ones prepare for another war that nobody asked them to fight, the silence is absolute. 11 warriors sitting in absolute stillness, carrying the knowledge of what they are, wearing the doom of what they serve, moving toward a battlefield that the rest of the galaxy does not yet know matters. The renegade god sees them, and he laughs.